Okay.
Still long.
Okay, good morning. The time is now 8:30 and I'd like to call the May 16th, 2025 meeting of the Energy Facility Siting Council to order. Secretary Esserson, could you please call the roll?
Kent Howell,
Here.
Cindy Condon,
Here.
Marcy Grail,
Here.
Ann Byer,
Here.
Richard Devlin, and Katie Imes.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Are there any agenda modifications?
Mr. Chair, there are no agenda modifications at this time.
Okay. Well, I have the following announcements. Sarah Esterson, the Siting Division Senior Policy Advisor, will be the council secretary for this meeting as part of the Siting Division's resiliency efforts. For council members and anyone addressing the council, please remember to state your name clearly. Please do not use the speakerphone feature as it will create feedback. Please mute your phones, and if you are joining us by phone and receive a phone call, please hang up from this call and dial back in after finishing your other call. For those signed on to the webinar, please do not broadcast your webcam. For agenda item D, the public comment period, there are 3 ways to let us know you are interested in providing comments to the council. For those in person, please fill out a registration card and submit to Nancy Hatch. For those using the WebEx, you'll need to use the raise your hand feature. For those on the phone only, you'll need to press *3, which will alert us that you want to speak. And we'll go over these options again during that agenda item. If you want to receive future email notifications of council meetings, project milestones, or rulemakings through our Click Dimensions program, you can do so by clicking on the link in the agenda or on the council webpage. Look for the green box on the right-hand side of the page that says sign up for email updates. You are also welcome to access the online project mapping tool and any documents by visiting our website. Please note that the audio and video of this meeting is being recorded and may be posted to the council's website following the meeting. Energy Facility Council meetings shall be conducted in a respectful and courteous manner where everyone is allowed to state their positions at the appropriate times, consistent with council rules and procedures. Willful, accusatory, offensive, insulting, threatening, insolent, or slanderous comments which disrupt the council meeting are not acceptable. Pursuant to Oregon Administrative Rule 345-011-0080, any person who engages in unacceptable conduct which disrupts the meeting may be expelled. So we're ready then for approval of the March 21, 2025 minutes. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Cindy Condon, second.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a motion by Councilor Devlin, a second by Vice Chair Condon. Could you please call the roll?
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Kent Howell,
Yes.
Richard Devlin,
Yes.
Katie Imes,
Yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yeah.
Marcy Grail.
Yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we're ready for the council secretary report. So Secretary Esterson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So first, we'll start with project updates. Since the last council meeting in March, the Siting Division has received 2 preliminary amendment requests. We've issued a draft proposed order on an amendment request and held 1 public informational meeting on a notice of intent. And we'll give you a few details about each of those. So for the amendment requests, on April 21st, 2025, Portland General Electric submitted a preliminary amendment request number 4 for the Bigelow Canyon Wind Farm site certificate. The Bigelow Canyon Wind Farm has been operational since 2007. It's a 450 megawatt wind facility in Sherman County. And the amendment request seeks council approval to add approximately 4,000 acres to the site boundary to incorporate up to 385 megawatts of solar and battery. So based on the location and size of the solar components, it will require review of a Goal 3 exception request, and we are anticipating that this review will take about 6 to 9 months before a draft proposed order would be ready, given the scope and complexity. Okay, next, that second amendment request I referred to was received on April 24th, 2025 from Sunset Solar Center LLC, which is a subsidiary of Avangrid Power LLC. They submitted preliminary amendment request number 1 for the Sunset Solar Project Site Certificate. This is an approved, not yet constructed 103 megawatt solar facility located in Wasco County, or approved to be located. And the amendment request seeks council review and approval of an extension of the construction commencement and completion deadlines. The current deadline is April 24th, 2025. Obviously, that's passed, but they submitted the request, which stayed that deadline, seeking to extend that by 3 years to April 2028. The amendment request also seeks to reduce the size of the site boundary from about 10,000 acres to about 1,800 acres. Okay, and draft proposed orders issued on April 16th. The department issued a draft proposed order on request for amendment 2 of the Obsidian Solar Center site certificate under the Type B review process. This amendment request seeks approval of a construction deadline extension. The department established a 30-day comment period on the draft proposed order and complete amendment request. That's actually set to conclude today. No comments have been received yet so far. Just a quick note on amendment process. There are currently 4 amendment processes in council rules: type A, B, C, and the transfer process. The most typical amendments are either type A or B, where the difference between type A, which is our standard, is that it includes a public hearing on the draft proposed order and has a formal council review of the draft proposed order. So type B, that the Obsidian Amendment 2 request is being processed under, omits those 2 elements. Council's first public review of the Obsidian Solar Center request for Amendment 2 is forecasted to occur at the June meeting. So it's important that you understand the draft proposed order. It's available online. Public comments are being posted if we receive them online through the comment portal, and you would be expected to review those in advance of the meeting in June. Okay, and we had one public meeting on April 24th in Boardman, Oregon, on the notice of intent for a proposed 800 megawatt solar battery project proposed by Pacificor. That's the Sunrise Solar and Storage Projects. It is proposed on approximately 6,981 acres, which translates to about 21 square miles. I think it's the next largest we've ever seen, which is just the ongoing narrative of what we have to say, but and proposed on private land zoned for exclusive farm use. Just noting that this public meeting, we had individuals present, but there were no comments provided at that meeting. And many thanks to Councillor Imes for her attendance at this meeting. Always appreciated. And a couple of construction updates for you. In April, Avangrid commenced pre-construction compliance for review of portions of the Oregon Trail Solar Project. This is an approved solar battery facility in Gillum County. Phase 1 that Avangrid is planning to move forward with is limited to 20 megawatts of battery energy storage. And this is expected to commence in June, July. In May, Northwest Natural received approval from the department to commence phase 1 of facility changes that were approved in Amendment 13 of the MIST underground natural gas storage facility. Phase 1 is limited to replacement of 1 existing turbine-driven compressor at the Miller Station. Construction activities are expected to continue in phases over the next 5 years. So we'll continue to update you on that. And then pre-construction for the Boardman to Hemingway transmission line continues. We've been in that process for over 2 years. But they actually just got confirmation this morning that we are expecting them to commence, them being Idaho Power Company, to commence construction in July. So we are gearing up. That's going to be a big effort. And some compliance updates. So it is officially annual reporting season for certificate holders of operating facilities. Annual reports were due on April 30th. So we have about 30 operational facilities. That's 30 fairly big reports. BB Bartley, our operations and policy analyst, has really been leading the coordination effort with certificate holders on expectations for how they submit their annual report, when they submit it, the format, everything. And she's been managing that data very well. So thank you, BB. We've also implemented a new workload split in compliance for operational facilities. We have enlisted the support of the senior siting analysts for just a few facilities. They each are taking one on. It's their responsibility to manage operational compliance review for one facility. And then we have Haley and Aldrich, our consultant, is helping with 3. And then that leaves the remaining 23 to our compliance officer positions, Dwayne Kilsdonk and Egan Bull. So they get the bulk. They get the hardest ones. And it is our goal to complete these annual compliance reviews before the end of the year. Okay. Gonna work. Okay, and then one compliance update from last month. We had 2 findings of non-compliance for the Leaning Juniper Wind Power Facility repower. The Leaning Juniper Wind Power Facility is an existing operational facility. It's an Avangrid facility being repowered in Gillum County. Repower refers to the replacement of blades in the cells of existing wind turbines. So we had 2 findings based on our most recent site inspection. The first finding was based on a condition that requires that Avangrid have an on-site construction manager that's responsible for ensuring compliance with repower-related conditions. During pre-construction, Avangrid had provided the name and qualifications of a construction manager. When we were on site, it was identified that they were not on site. The condition specifically requires that they be on site. Not like literally every single minute of every day, but generally every day. And that's not how it was being managed. We believe the word on site was missed, and they've since resolved the issue by designating a construction contractor as the on-site construction manager. We haven't received final reporting, but we do track compliance on a biweekly basis. And so this has been the confirmation they provided. The second finding was based on a requirement of the noxious weed plan, where wheel washing stations are required in specific areas where equipment's going to be used and set up for use. And it was identified that it wasn't set up or in the right location. Avangrid has since resolved this by sending pictures of the correction. We are still waiting on formal written response to verify. Okay, and then a quick legislative update for you. So some key dates that haven't yet happened. May 23rd is the second chamber deadline. Bills must have a work session and be voted out of committee to move forward. June 18th is the targeted end of session, and June 29th is constitutional end of session. So the bills that remain to date are those that we are going to move through here for you. First of most interest is kind of what we call the FSEC bill, House Bill 3681. A work session was held, so that's moving forward. The next bill is Senate Bill 1034. This is an interesting one where it would remove the ability for FSEC to process applications and not apply local substantive criteria. We've talked about all these bills before, so if you have any questions about what they are, let me know. Otherwise, I'm kind of moving through them quickly. Okay, next slide, please, Nancy. House Bill 3874 is the change in FSEC jurisdictional threshold for wind facilities, changing the threshold from 50 to 100. Okay, and then lastly, Senate Bill 2410 is related to small modular nuclear power plants. That is continuing to move forward. Okay. And then I just have a few, oh. Where'd Tom go? Okay, I'd like to interject a quick update on rulemakings that are in process. And Tom indicated he is willing and prepared to provide that.
Yeah, thanks for that ample notice, Sarah. So yeah, just to give you all an update, we had a few rulemakings initiate 2 council meetings ago, the exemption rulemaking and the modernization rulemaking. And those are both underway. Neither of those have a rulemaking advisory committee. And we are internally preparing draft language for those for consideration. However, again, just as a reminder, if anybody has any thoughts or feelings about either of those rulemakings, there's no reason why you shouldn't. In fact, you should reach out to me to let me know what your thoughts are about those rulemakings. We have the 2024 site certificate amendment rulemaking, which is just about to get to the point where we are going to present the notice of proposed rulemaking to council. We had the final RAC meeting in April, and I feel like we're in a pretty good place with that one, and I'm excited to go over those proposed amendment or changes to the amendment rules, the amended rules at a future council meeting. And then we have the radioactive transport fee rulemaking, which is being done in partnership with the Nuclear Safety and Emergency Preparedness Team. That rulemaking is related to some rules in Division 60 that are related to fees that are assessed for those who are transporting radioactive materials in the state of Oregon. And actually, the first RAC for that is scheduled for May 28th from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. And those are all the updates I have this time.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah.
Counselor Byer?
If we can get updates on rulemakings as part of the secretary's report, just because there's a lot going on and it's easy to lose track of where we are in the schedule. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. We can incorporate that. No problem. Okay, just a few remaining items. I don't know if you noticed, but we do have a new keypad on the restrooms. They are being installed and activated. So the next time we have a meeting here, you will need to make sure you have the code or just request that you have the code. Some notes on the June meeting, the June 13th, the next council meeting is planned for June 13th. We expect to be here in Salem. Tentative agenda items include council review of the proposed order for the Obsidian Solar Center request for Amendment 2. And that proposed order would be subject to review, approval, modification, or rejection. Compliance rulemaking initiation. We're so excited. Let's see, the notice of proposed rulemaking for the amendment rules. Review of the Trojan Security Plan Revision 10. We'll do a review of the need standard for non-generating facilities and a legislative update. So you can expect that in June. And with that, I believe we're ready for our first agenda item.
Okay, thank you, Secretary Esterson. The next item is the Muddy Creek Energy Park Notice of Intent Extension Request. It's an action item. And we have Chase McVeigh Walker, Senior Siting Analyst, that will review this request with us. The floor is yours. Nice, bright, springy shirt.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, well, good morning, Chair Howe, Vice Chair Condon, members of the council. For the record, my name is Chase McVeigh Walker, and I'm a senior siting analyst here at the department. Oh, there we go. Okay. Oh, you did it. Okay. As the chair just mentioned, the council has received a petition to grant a one-year extension on the notice of intent to apply for a site certificate or an NOI for the Muddy Creek Energy Park. The applicant of the proposed facility, Muddy Creek Energy Park LLC, submitted the notice of intent on May 19th, 2023. Under council's rules, a notice of intent expires 2 years after its submittal date, unless the applicant submits a petition for extension at least 45 days before the expiration date. Based on the submittal date of the NOI will expire on May 19th of this year, 2025, which is this upcoming Monday. On March 31st of this year, 2025, which is 49 days before the NOI expiration date, the applicant submitted a petition to extend the notice of intent expiration date by 1 year. And before I go over the extension request itself, I'll give you a brief overview on the proposed facility. Okay. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the applicant for this proposed facility is Muddy Creek Energy Park LLC, a wholly owned subsidiary of Hanwha Qcells USA Corporation. This slide, the right half of the slide, shows the proposed facility in relation to Interstate 5, which is that blue line running north-south, and also the proposed facility in relation to a few cities, which I've called out here with text boxes. The facility itself, the site boundary, is in the middle of that map, and it's that black outlined polygon. And the site boundary for the proposed Muddy Creek Energy Park is approximately 1,588 acres or 2.5 square miles. And all land within the site boundary is zoned exclusive farm use. And the proposed facility is also located or would be located in Lynn County, Oregon. As proposed, the Muddy Creek Energy Park would have a generating capacity of approximately 199 megawatts of solar photovoltaic energy generation. Related or supporting facility components proposed would include up to 199 megawatts of battery energy storage, a collector substation, a power collection system, approximately a half a mile of overhead 230 kilovolt transmission line, a point of interconnection, perimeter fencing, access roads, and staging areas. And the facility would interconnect with an existing Pacific Core 230 kilovolt transmission line and substation. And the substation's the Diamond Hill substation. And I know it's hard to see on this figure, but the existing Pacific Core transmission line is a dotted green line to the right of I-5, which is that blue line. And the existing transmission line runs north-south, and the existing Pacific Core substation is more near the center of the proposed facility. So the council's rules provide the applicant 2 years from the date of submitting an NOI to submit their preliminary application for site certificate. The consideration of a notice of intent extension is important because if the applicant does not submit a preliminary application for a site certificate or obtain an extension before the NOI expires, the applicant must submit a new NOI and start from the beginning to proceed with the siting process. Submission of a timely petition for extension stays the expiration of the NOI until council makes its decision. And council's rules provide that if you receive a timely petition, you may grant an extension of up to 1 year if the petition shows good cause. On the next slide, I'll summarize the notice of intent extension petition and reasons provided for the request. As I previously mentioned, the applicant submitted its petition 49 days before the expiration of the NOI, which is considered timely. Having a timely petition in hand, the council may grant the extension if you find that the petition shows good cause. To summarize the petition, the applicant explains that the 1 year extension is needed to allow sufficient time to complete resource studies, the agrivoltaics management plan, and to prepare and submit the preliminary application for site certificate. A summary of the NOI extension request or petition, as well as supplemental information provided by the applicant in response to department's information requests, was included as attachment 1 to the staff report for this agenda item. In the subsequent responses to the department's information requests, the applicant noted that both the Oregon Department of State Lands and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers requested a site visit to the site. Following review of an August 2023 wetland delineation and a preliminary jurisdictional determination. The site visit was scheduled for February 29th of last year, but due to heavy precipitation, it was postponed and rescheduled by a month to March 28th of last year. During the site visit, significantly more wetlands and wet areas were observed than previously delineated, which prompted a request for a new wetland delineation. Between March and May of last year, 2024, additional field work and landowner coordination resulted in a revised wetland delineation identifying the presence of considerably more wetlands. Due to the observation and delineation of considerably more wetlands, from June of last year until March of this year, 2025, the applicant developed 4 complete redesigns of the site plan to ensure wetland impacts would be minimized, potential mitigation measures formulated, and to determine whether the project remains viable. Part of the value of the notice of intent phase is for the applicant to learn more information about the project area and make necessary adjustments to the project design in order to avoid or minimize impacts to important resources. With this in mind, the department recommends council find that the unanticipated discovery of more wetlands than originally delineated, the additional time required to evaluate the impacts to wetlands, including coordination with the Department of State Lands and the United States Army Corps of Engineers, supplemental seasonal dependent field surveying, revising the wetland delineation, and redesigning the project multiple times represents good cause for an extension to the notice of intent by 1 year. Following receipt of the applicant's notice of intent extension request, the department received a comment from a member of the public. The council's rules at OAR 345-020-0060 do not include a public notice requirement nor a public comment period and the department is unaware of the council ever soliciting or taking public comments on an NOI extension request. To remain consistent with past practices and save time and resources by not introducing a new process step to evaluate public comments and applicant responses, the department recommends council not consider any public comments submitted regarding this NOI extension request. Were council to accept and consider public comments in this instance, in fairness to the applicant, the department would recommend council allow the applicant an opportunity to respond to such comments. And with that, I will conclude my presentation and hand it back to you, Chair Howe, for deliberation.
Any comments or questions? Counselor Devlin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a clarification for the record, perhaps we can say, this is, in a sense, an extension that is just simply normal. We allow a one-year extension. Should we be, have a request that comes in after this, or let's say, after the, I know, soft spoken. If we had a request that was literally after this date, or that requested a longer extension, let's just say that, like a 2 or 3 year extension, what would be our rule for that? Would it be allowed? Would there be public testimony?
You mean on a different project or on the same project, or is it?
On this project, let's just say that this request hadn't come in. And they got close to the date, but they wanted like a 2 year extension. What would be the applicable rule in this case?
The rule as it stands only allows for a 1 year extension.
Oh,
So you wouldn't be able to extend it for 2 years.
okay. So you'd have to start the process over again.
And the deadline for them to submit their preliminary application is Monday.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Just to clarify, Mr. Chair. If you're ready, if there's no other questions.
Vice Chair Condon?
Thank you. Just one question. There's a single property owner involved in this project, correct?
I believe there's multiple property owners.
So it's all on private property.
Correct.
What I'm just kind of curious about, maybe it doesn't matter. Let me just ask a second question. It's limited to one extension request, right? There's not an opportunity for a second extension request.
Correct. Up to 1 year. But it is
Right,
up to
right.
1 year.
Right. Thank you.
Counselor Byer?
So based on the information about the wetlands delineation, it appears that whatever is submitted as a preliminary application will be significantly different than the original notice of intent. Does that change our process at all? Or it's what we get as the preliminary site certificate application that will dictate the process from there on out? I see not. So, okay, so even though we may see a considerably different project, when we finally get an application within the 1 year period, we would, even though the notice of intent may have been broader.
This is Sarah Esterson, Council Secretary. Just to clarify, I mean, they can modify within the bounds of where they started, right? It's not like we can move the site to a totally different location and it's a different facility, but we're still under the same NOI. But as we understand it, they are refining within the original footprint and you can shrink down. Otherwise, they would have to start over.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Counselor Devlin.
I move approval of the extension.
We've got a motion from Counselor Devlin for approval. Is there a second?
This is Marcy. I second.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second. Secretary Esterson, could you please call the roll?
Ann Byer,
Yes, but I would caveat it that we have found just cause or good cause for granting the extension based on the staff report.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Richard Devlin,
Yes.
Marcy Grail,
Yes.
Kent Howe,
Yes.
and Katie Imes.
Yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Mr. McVeigh Walker, for your presentation. The next item is the battery storage technology overview. We have Tom Jackman, our rules coordinator, that prepared a fantastic staff report for explaining this. It was very impressive.
This is what I do in my free time, okay? Good morning. For the record, my name is Tom Jackman. I am the rules coordinator for the council. And I volunteered to write this report because this is something, a topic that I am interested in a lot. So what sort of prompted the this report was HB 4015, which passed in 2024 and defined a battery energy storage system, which I'm going to call a BESS, as a facility that stores and later discharges energy using rechargeable batteries. This previously had no definition. So now we have an official definition. And of course, council had seen, battery storage projects associated with facilities, but there was no sort of formal structure in statute or rules discussing how to treat those. So the other thing that HB 4015 did was it added a BESS to the list of things that do not require a separate site certificate when built as a related or supporting facility, which is what we were doing, but now it's official. That's the proper procedure. And then it also formally allowed developers or local governments in consultation with developers the choice to have a standalone BESS reviewed through FSEC rather than through a county process, just like any other energy facility. Any questions about the legislation? That's pretty narrow in scope. So it didn't do anything more than that. It didn't set up a framework for how to analyze a BESS or anything else. It was just the definition and then sort of the formalization of how someone who wanted to get a permit for a BESS would go about doing that. So why batteries? This is a very super interesting time that we live in. But as we see, all of our new energy generation in Oregon is renewable. But renewable energy, of course, is variable, both daily and seasonally. The energy generation doesn't always line up with peak demand. One interesting thing from this chart you'll see is that the wind generation sort of pairs well with the solar generation. And also with the hydro too, actually, for that matter. So the more diversity you have in your energy structure, the more variability you can absorb, right? If you put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, it really restricts your ability to provide a steady base, predictable power supply to meet the forecasted demand. So batteries is just another source of energy that creates diversity in the energy supply. So it does a couple of things. One of the earliest things it did, because it was the most profitable, at least initially, was it ensured that peak demands are met. So one of the most expensive forms of energy in the US is energy from a peaker plant, typically gas or coal, and it can be 10, 20 times as expensive, even more, depending on the time or the situation, as baseload power generation. So it did not take long for batteries to be significantly cheaper than these peaker plants. But they're not only cheaper, but they're better in nearly every way. So the adoption has, as we'll see here, if you read the report, has skyrocketed for these reasons. One of which is that it reduces the need for curtailing. So the more energy you have, I mean, you only fit so much energy on the system. So if you have a really, nice spring day in California and nobody's running their air conditioner or their heater or anything, and the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, you have way more energy than you need, and the grid simply can't handle that much energy. So the peak production period for renewable energy relative to demand in California is a 116-day period from early spring to early summer. And 96 of those 116 days last year, they had to essentially tell energy providers, you can't send us any more power. So that's called curtailing. And obviously, if you have batteries, then you have somewhere to send that extra power. And the interesting thing about curtailing is that turning off your system, turning back on can actually cost, I mean, it does cost money. And so the price of energy in California during these days goes negative. So these energy operators will literally pay battery energy storage facility operators to take their extra energy so they don't have to mess with their stuff, essentially. So a lot of incentives to build these systems. And then obviously, if you have those batteries, then you can, and we're seeing them attached to these other projects, it enables you to have a greater return on investment on your solar or your wind, because you can utilize more of the power. You're never forced to curtail. And then, or I should say, there's less curtailing, because even California has increasing number of batteries. They're still having to curtail. It also helps regulate the energy grid voltage, which is a super duper interesting topic that it's crazy to me that we've successfully do it and have done it for 100 years. But the energy that is created has to be consumed instantly, essentially. So there is no traveling. It's not like a water flowing down a canal to get to the source. You can't just, bank it somewhere while it pools up. It has to be generated and used within, fractions of a second. So obviously there are demand spikes and there are ways to deal with that. But one of the great things about batteries is they can regulate the amount of energy they either take in or send out within microseconds. So they're way, way better at other methodologies that have been used pretty successfully, but there have been rolling blackouts in Texas and California, and some of that had to do with the inability to regulate the grid voltage. And I don't know the last time you heard about California having a brownout or a blackout, but as they've increased the amount of batteries on their grid, they've reduced the need to have those blackouts. So they're great. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly. Oh, this slide was pretty cool. I thought this is the increasing amount of curtailing in California since 2017. And this is the most recent slide I could find, goes through October 2023. So that bar was even higher for that year, but it is literally gigawatt hours. This is how much energy a whole facility would produce is being sort of thrown away. So there are a lot of incentives to figure out how do we take advantage of that. And batteries is one of them. So this is another interesting slide. This shows you a little bit about why things are going the way they are. This is the price of a lithium-ion battery pack, which is, as we'll discuss later, the most common BESS battery system in the world right now. But what's interesting about this chart is this is a 10-year period, and it goes from almost $800 per kilowatt hour down to almost $100 per kilowatt hour in 10 years. And the interesting thing about this is the commodity prices for the materials that go in those battery packs hasn't really changed much. It's gone down a little bit. And it actually spiked in 2022, which is why you see that plus 7%. It was entirely due to the price of nickel and lithium and other materials that go into these batteries. But the bulk of 90, I would say +% of the price reduction has to do with the ability to produce these cheaper. So the manufacturing. And if you look at the bar on 2023 and 2024, the amount of cost due to manufacturing is just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. I don't know how much lower it's going to go, but we're also figuring out ways to get cheaper lithium and nickel and all that stuff too. But we're approaching as cheap as it goes, I would say, at least in the foreseeable future. So obviously these falling prices, you'll remember that graph started in 2013. We were producing almost no utility scale battery capacity at that time. And it didn't really start until, I don't know, 2018, 2019. So just a couple of years ago. But it has skyrocketed and it is essentially exponential here. Just if, we zoomed out even slightly to 26, 27, it's basically a straight line up. So we're going to see a lot more of these projects. So this slide was super interesting. I thought this shows you what the batteries do. This is a spring a day, April 2021 on the left. And it's kind of hard to read, but it's imports, gas, solar power, wind, hydro, and nuclear. And you can see solar does a big, it does a lot in the middle of the day when the sun is out, but then it sort of disappeared at the end and it doesn't exist in the beginning. So these battery systems have taken a huge chunk out of the gas facilities. If you look at the bit on the right there, the width of those sections are kind of the same for all of them, but gas is almost cut in half. So it has dramatically reduced their need to burn fossil fuels to produce energy on a spring day. So I thought that's pretty cool. Can you click yeah, you're fine. All right. Okay, so let's talk about batteries in Oregon. This is a picture of Texas. There are like no pictures. Every single article I found on batteries in Oregon, like from the Oregonian, has a photo from like Texas or California. So do we. So we have a handful of batteries that are currently in operation, a 6 megawatt, 100 megawatt, and a 30 megawatt. And then there's Bake Oven is under construction right now as a 303 megawatt facility. To give you a sense of size, the largest battery facility currently under construction in California will be 600 megawatts. And then Texas has 3 600-ish megawatt facilities. And so 300 is pretty big. It's, those states have pretty high energy demands. And you can see down here, we have Wagon Trail Solar and Sunstone Solar at 2,000 megawatts and 1,200 megawatts. If constructed, I mean, obviously those, it take a minute for those to get constructed, but if constructed, those would be the largest, either of them would be the largest battery facilities in the country by a significant margin. So, I mean, the Sunstone will be twice as big. And one other thing to keep in mind is that I'm just talking about megawatts here. If you want to, most of these facilities are 3 or 4, sometimes 5 hours. So I think Sunstone Solar is 5 hours. And so it's actually 7.2 gigawatt hours of power. But some of them could be, like just 2 hours, for example. That's going to change significantly the amount of batteries you need. If you want to have twice as many hours, you just need twice as many batteries. So the hours is a big deal, but almost all of these are roughly 3 to 5 hours. So can you click the thing again? Yeah, you're fine. Okay, so yes, question, sure.
Tom, I'm sorry. Could you just explain for a second megawatts versus megawatt hours? I mean, most of us are familiar with megawatt hours from our utility bill.
Sure. So you just think about the megawatts as the number of households that you could serve. So if you want to have, you could have a 10 gigawatt facility that could only power, however many houses that would serve for 30 minutes. Or you could have a 100 megawatt facility that could serve a much smaller number of households for 20 hours. So the utility or the facility developer has to sort of decide kind of like where the sweet spot is on the size of the batteries. The bigger the batteries, the less likely you are to, the bigger the megawatts, the less likely you are to actually use them all, right? If your system is oversized, some of the batteries are just going to sit there, right? So you have to kind of right size the size of the power levels, and then decide, okay, well, how many hours do we want to serve? It's the same problem. If you have 20 hours versus 10 hours, the likelihood that you would need 20 hours is just going to be lower than the likelihood that you'll need 10 hours. The smaller your system, the greater chance you'll make use of every bit of it. But obviously, it's sort of like, it's a gamble, right? The bigger the system, the more money you could potentially make, but the higher risk that you won't make any money or you'll lose money. So these developers have, I'm sure, run the numbers, so to speak, in terms of figuring this out. And they're not obviously going to be the first ones to build larger facilities. There is now a lot of data that exists which shows these existing BESS systems are incredibly profitable. So they are, and they, as I showed you on that earlier slide, they do a lot of functions. And the people who own these systems literally sell these functions. They'll sell the grid stabilization as a sort of service, right? It's not just about the number of kilowatt hours you deliver. It is literally, you pay us and we'll help regulate your grid, for example. So there's different ways to monetize this, but yeah, it's number of households versus how long. And of course, 5 hours is not a week or a month. So none of these systems is going to prevent is the need for baseload power in the event of, stormy weather for 2 months or whatever. So there's the ways of dealing with that are more variability, more power lines, but it's not going to be solved by lithium-ion batteries, at least not for the time being. Any other questions?
Councilor Devlin.
There's also obviously, in terms of this, depending upon what sort of contracts they have, a real incentive in terms of achieving the best price for the power that you're providing. I mean, at times, one of the things that we've seen in the last decade is people, when you're really short of power, are almost willing to pay anything. And so to have this power available, sometimes during the day it might be not worth a lot. Sometimes during the day it might be worth 10 times that amount or more.
Yeah, and in unregulated markets like in Texas, when they've had power issues, the power will go from 30 cents a kilowatt hour to $30 a kilowatt hour. Just spiking up as you have a mismatch between supply and demand. So yeah, there's some shrewd folks here. This is just another tool in the toolkit for how we securely provide power. It's just like any other market, the more sources you have, like the lower, the more cost competitive you have to be to compete. Can you click the thing? Okay. You're fine.
On the Morrow County, this is Kent, on the Morrow County items, there are 1,200 megawatts.
Yeah.
Do you have roughly an idea of the acreage of coverage of those?
I do not.
Okay.
I mean, it's in their
Yeah.
certificate, but
Yeah, I think that both of those are approved for centralized or dispersed. So it's like intermixed with the
Intermixed.
footprint of the solar, or if it's centralized, it's just encompassed by the larger solar, which Sunstone's 10,000 acres, Wagon Trail's 7,000 acres, I think,
Okay.
in that range.
Thank you.
so, and then we have 4 that are currently under proposed review by the council, and these are also pretty sizable. I mean, 800 would be enormous again in Morrow County. They're going to have a lot of batteries potentially, and then a 1,200 and 1,000. So I suspect that we'll see similar sized systems in California and Texas and other states, Florida probably, but none that I could see that were proposed, at least publicly available. So Oregon's apparently the battery hotspot for whatever reason. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the battery technology. I just wanted to go through some sort of existing and sort of best type systems. Pumped hydro is one that has been around for a long time, and it will continue to be around. And there are still projects that are being planned and developed, but it's sort of you need a specific sort of spot for it. You can't just put these up everywhere. So there is actually, and these are reviewed by federal regulators. So FSEC will never see this, but there's a project in the gorge right now that's currently under review or construction. So this is definitely not old technology. It's still being used.
Counselor Devlin?
And obviously, there is one that has been under operation for quite a while, and that's Grand Coulee. But it's used for agricultural purposes more than for backup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you go next slide. Oops. So this one's kind of interesting. It's been around a while and has a lot of functionalities. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the flywheel, but essentially it's just a rotor that's spun in a vacuum with very low friction. And when you need the energy, you just draw down on the stored mechanical energy. And it actually, but it, you're talking minutes, not hours, not days. And when lithium was $1 zillion per kilowatt hour, this was being used in certain places for certain things, but has just been absolutely obliterated by the advances in lithium ion technology. So, and then another one, these are currently being marketed. I don't know how successful these are going to be, but this graphic is from a company that is currently trying to market this technology right now, which is thermal batteries. And that is a giant vat of sand. And you basically just use solar, wind, whatever, to heat up the sand and then just draw down on that heat for, future use. So essentially a heat battery. So, but unlikely to serve, tens of thousands of households or whatever. And then this one is interesting, and we are seeing this, and we are going to continue to see this. This is a vanadium flow redox battery. And what's interesting about this battery is that the negative and positive cathode and anode for the battery system are not solid state. They are they're giant tanks of electrolytes. And what's interesting about vanadium is that it's very easy to scale up. So if you want to have more megawatt hours, you just got bigger tanks. And the other interesting thing about it is that it doesn't suffer from nearly the same levels of degradation that lithium ion batteries do. So you can 0 to 100 to 0 these for 20 years, and you're going to have similar capacity, whereas lithium batteries are going to slowly degrade over time. So we're seeing these. I think the pricing is still not quite there, but it's close enough that for certain uses, we are seeing them continue to be planned and developed. And I think there is some expectation that the pricing on this will continue to get more competitive. It is more land intensive. So you're going to see bigger installations, but honestly, none of these is that big. If you compared a 2 gigawatt battery facility to a 2 gigawatt, fossil fuel plant, I mean, the batteries are pretty competitive from an acre standpoint. So building these in lieu of something else, you are definitely impacting the land less. However, so this is the world's largest redox flow battery. It's in China, and this is not it's sort of, the lighting makes it look like it's just like a computer graphic. This is a picture of the installation. And it is 175 megawatts. I don't know how many hours it is, but I would assume probably, like 4, 5, 6. Could be longer. I mean, that's the beauty of this system, is you would use it when you need more hours. But you can see what it looks like. Instead of having these sort of big rig, trailer thingies, you have those, but then they have a sort of, it's almost like a bed where you have the the taller part attached to a flat part. So, but it's not, I mean, from an aerial standpoint, like this doesn't really look all that different, right? And somebody who's driving by, you know, it's a little taller, but it's not really that different than the lithium systems. Okay, so let's talk about lithium batteries. This slide shows you kind of the two main battery types that are currently being used by BESS installations. The one on the right is lithium nickel manganese cobalt oxide, and it is in 90+% of EVs. And it was, these battery cells were developed specifically for electric vehicles. And the reason is, you can see in the middle of the slide on the right, there's energy density. So they have the highest energy density of any sort of proven battery system. But lithium iron phosphate is being increasingly used in cars, and it is just absolutely taking over the BESS world, although the supply chain has to kind of ramp up. Can you click the presentation? So the lithium iron phosphate is much safer because it operates at a lower temperature and therefore is significantly less likely to experience thermal runaway, which is the issue that the lithium nickel manganese cobalt has. And it has a lower energy density, but it also has 2 to 3 times longer lifespan. So for a BESS, for cars, you know, maybe you don't care as much because the manganese cobalt batteries can go for 500,000 miles. So you don't need 2 to 3 times longer. But for a BESS system where you're just constantly discharging and charging it, you know, daily, 2 to 3 times longer, you know, is a significant benefit. So for these BESS folks, the idea of not having to deal with, you know, with something in 10 years and instead maybe 20 years is very appealing. And then another big thing is the cobalt. So lithium, nickel, manganese are all sort of relatively easy to get. Nickel is actually quite expensive, and is a big issue for scaling those batteries, maybe more so than the lithium. But the cobalt is primarily sourced from the Congo region in Africa through not the best methods, we'll say. So it is somewhat controversial, and I do think just from that standpoint alone, there's been a lot of pressure to switch battery systems to another chemistry. Okay, so this is what a module looks like. It just looks like a shipping container. You're fine. You got, I got it. Okay, so it's just literally racks of cells, right? Like these are just cylindrical, and they've gotten bigger over time. You know, they used to be the size of AA batteries, and now they're, you know, quadruple D. They just keep making bigger and bigger because it's more cost effective at higher energy density to make them larger if you can. So there have been advances on that front. But if you sort of opened all that up, you would just see cells of batteries, little cylinders. And they just pack the cells together and then into little tray thingies, and then they pack those into racks, and they pack those racks into these modules. So that module has, you know, a zillion little batteries in it. Okay, so this is an old graphic, but the bars are still actually pretty accurate. So this is 2011 to 2016. But I just thought this was kind of fun because it showed back in 2011, lead acid batteries were a big chunk of sort of larger battery installations. This is in the United States. Lithium was still a pretty big chunk, but flywheel was, you know, that sort of light green color was a big. 2012 had a bumper year, but that in 2012, the entire United States saw 0.35 gigawatt hours. So that's in the whole country, and we're seeing, or sorry, gigawatts, and we're seeing, you know, a single installation that's 1.2 gigawatts in Oregon. So we were basically not installing hardly anything in 2012. And then you can see even by 2016, which was halfway through that cost curve chart, lithium had taken over. And obviously being significantly cheaper than even in 2016, that trend has continued. And lithium is in over 90% of BESS systems. So we don't need to go into this. This is in the chart or in the report, but It kind of goes through the suitability for BESS, but lithium ion, it's cheap, it's known. There's a huge supply chain for it, largely because of EVs, which consume the vast majority of these batteries. Although I think we'll start to see more and more batteries for BESS systems. But we have zinc, which is a sort of a new thing. It's up and coming. It's a relatively cheap element. It's safer. It operates at a lower temperature than the nickel metal ones or manganese ones. But all of these people are risk averse. So zinc is sort of newer and I think less established. But I do think we're going to see more and more zinc batteries. And then the vanadium redox, the same cycle length, zero degradation, can support like 12 hours of storage instead of 4 or 5. Absolutely no possibility of thermal runaway since your battery is essentially a liquid, but it has lower energy density and it's more expensive. And then iron air is kind of interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on this one, but it's essentially uses rusting and reverse rusting to generate energy, and but has a massive footprint. So like the size of a water treatment plant. But you could have 100+ hour battery system. So people are looking at having kind of very small, because again, the smaller the system, the greater likelihood you'll take advantage of it, but then a lot of hours, right? So sort of really starting to just chip away at the base load power. Okay, so let's talk about safety, because that's largely what I think people think about when they think about these battery installations, for better or worse. Certainly what makes the news when you hear about one. It's not usually because they're being announced, but one of them is on fire. So one of the most recent ones, and it was significant because I think it was 300 megawatts, which was one of the largest battery installations in the country at the time, was the Moss Landing battery facility in California. Had experienced thermal runaway, and essentially all 300 megawatts went up in smoke literally overnight. But this is sort of a cautionary tale, but also I think you'll see kind of illustrates why there's maybe less of this is less of an issue than people might otherwise think. First of all, you can see this is one of the largest battery installations. This was not built using the standard spacing that we see now in installations. I don't know exactly what they were thinking, but this was built using 2018 sort of battery code, and it was acceptable at the time to do it this way. But they shoved all those batteries into a like big building, and so the second there was thermal runaway, like I mean that's it. It's all gone now. So sort of like a spark in a a hay combine. It's all just packed together. But even so hot that it melted the concrete. The like air conditioning equipment on the right side of the building, and so there's some other stuff on the left side, totally unharmed. So it incinerated itself, but it didn't, spread out. There's not any, like if you have a forest fire, you have all of the embers and stuff floating in, and they catch and whatever. There are no embers. It's literally just incinerating itself at super high temperatures. And then there was concerns about the air quality. One of the big issues with batteries is they are full of sort of heavy toxic metals, and so when you light it on fire, one of the most dangerous ones is hydrogen fluoride. But they had they had tons of air quality monitoring stations in California, including around this facility, and they did a mandatory evacuation of 1,200 households around this facility because it's right there next to neighborhoods, unlike our Eastern Oregon facilities, which are kind of in the boonies. But even in the surrounding area, right around the facility, they determined there was none of the chemicals in the facility that were released by the fires exceeded EPA limits. So this was one of the largest BESS fires ever, and it was still relatively low impact in terms of the actual site and in the surrounding houses. And I did look into this, and I could not find a single known death due to a battery installation in the US. There have been some deaths in other countries during installation. They had some issues, but in the US we haven't had a single death. And once installed, I couldn't find instances of a single death. So versus like with fossil fuels, we have something like 50 to 200,000 deaths a year in the United States due to emissions, particulate emissions, half of which are attributed to fossil fuels. So, I mean, it's not even remotely close. So just think about that big chunk of power on that California slide that they're no longer burning those fuels because of the batteries. I mean, those are lives that are not going to be lost. So just sort of put the risks in perspective. So this is a typical lithium-ion BESS installation. This is actually, I forget what it's called or where it is, but this is the 600 megawatt facility in California that's currently, I think it's Mar Vista, but I could be wrong. I don't remember. It's in the report, but I forgot what it's called. But yeah, somewhere in California, you can sort of see this is being built in phases like all these installations are. I think that's 1/3 of it there in the back. Expected to fully go online next year. Okay, so, and, you know, as we sort of just alluded to earlier, the way they're built now, you get sort of compartmentalization. So even if there was to be thermal runaway, which by the way, all of these thermal runaways are the nickel metal, manganese, cobalt batteries. So it's, you lose one container, then you clean it up and you go back to, and you turn it back on. So it's not too crazy. So, and then safety standards are rapidly evolving. So some of these are updated annually, some of these are updated every 3 years, but there are, the National Fire Protection Association standards, which cover mitigation, explosive mitigation, early detection. You have the UL standards that require, robust fire prevention, response preparedness, explosive containment. So they're sort of overlapping standards in some cases, and they cover essentially almost every component of that module. And you can sort of see the standards are sort of linked to the various parts of the module there. So, and then this slide's kind of interesting. It's kind of hard to read, but the kind of reddish orange line there is failure incidents per deployed gigawatt hour in the world. And the purple line or bars are the number of incidents. And then the sort of slopey thing is the cumulative deployment of gigawatt hours. So over time, the failure incidents per deployed gigawatt hour around the world has fallen dramatically as the number of installations have gone up. So we're building more and more, and they're getting safer and safer. And there is definitely, people are going to have questions about recycling. As we talked about degradation, we're going to have gigawatt hours of lithium batteries that are going to need to be recycled at some point. But especially the nickel is quite expensive. So there have been companies that have popped up and are continuing to develop increasingly cheaper and more effective ways to deal with recycling. Some of this is regulatory, requiring batteries to be constructed in a way that makes them easier to recycle. One of the biggest problems with recycling is everybody comes up with sort of a different batteries manufacturing style or packaging, then you can't create a system that, mass recycles those. You need something that's more expensive and deals with different types of batteries. So there's all kinds of things that are afoot that are going to make this less and less of an issue, but it is a concern. We can't guarantee a market for these, and if there isn't one, then what do we do with all these batteries? Anyways, that's it.
Very well done.
Question.
Chair Condon.
Not so much a question, but a comment, a big thank you for the depth of this report. And what I'm trying to figure out with batteries, as the technology runs at a pretty fast pace for new materials, and we have an obligation on the wildfire standard for safety and health just in general, and how these developments kind of work in those areas for wildfire, certainly, and given what we have to review, but also just public safety, health and safety in general. So this report was, I just thought, very, very good in kind of going through not just the technology, but those issues of fire safety. And
From a regulatory standpoint, it's sort of a blessing and a curse how risk averse all these folks are. I mean, you need to install these and trust that they'll exist. You'll get your money back over the course of decades. So, I'm reading stuff about these types of technologies all the time, and it seems like every other week there's an article about a new cool battery that's really amazing and awesome, but you never see it because it has to prove that it's, can handle different temperatures, can handle sort of physical shock, can be cycled up and back, back and forth from 0 to 100 and back to 0 again without any issues, and on and on and on. So even with the nickel manganese cobalt batteries, which have some issues, the reason why we use them is because they are proven in many, many ways. So there have been some fires, but there's billions of cells. So the fires are 0.0000001% of the total number of cells that have ever been built. So it's a concern, but from a safety standpoint, I mean, they are incredibly safe from a statistical, and they've just gotten safer as we've improved the safety measures. And a lot of those fires are actually the result of a single manufacturer, LG, who was building batteries for BESS systems and also for car manufacturers. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Chevy Bolt, but they had a total recall of the Chevy Bolt because all of their batteries are built by LG, and they discovered there was some just slight, tiny issues with the way the cells were being manufactured that was causing, 1 in a million to have an issue. But they were building billions of these cells, so that was a problem. So even though there were only like 6 or, a handful of bolt fires relative to the number of bolts that were built, they replaced all of them eventually. They did a total recall of the batteries in those systems. But LG has, after spending billions of dollars on that, now has a better methodology for determining that the cells were constructed properly before they even get shipped to the consumer or the customer. So there are improvements from the very earliest stages from a safety standpoint, all the way to making sure that they're placed in a container and that container is, installed correctly. So things are moving fast, but also not that fast due to the sort of massive structures that are in place that kind of prevent rapid adoption. So pricing has gone down, but the actual technology hasn't really changed all that much.
Sorry, go ahead, Counselor. I was just gonna say, I have a book recommendation that I'm reading a book right now. It's called Power Metal: The Race for the Resources That Will Shape the Future. It's by a gentleman named Vince Beiser. So if you just look up Power Metal, and a lot of these materials that Tom has talked about in this presentation are discussed at length in the book. For example, lengthy analyses of where cobalt comes from, where copper, you didn't mention copper, but copper's essential in all the batteries, where the lithium comes from, what are the environmental ramifications, what are the political ramifications. I didn't know that most of the nickel in the world comes from Russia, and now Indonesia is trying to get into the game, but you can imagine the political ramifications of that. So I've really been enjoying it, and if you're interested, take a look at it. If you just do a Google search for Power Metal, it'll come up.
Councilor Devlin?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very much appreciate the report. I know people are concerned to some extent, but I do think that if you were to evaluate any type of power generation, you would find similar issues, perhaps more significant issues, particularly with gas turbines and other facilities. But one of the concerns I have, which you were not charged with addressing, is that some of the solar facilities, there may be hundreds of people involved in building the facility. And in the end, there are 7, 8, 9, 10 permanent staff. And they are in areas sometimes where there will be a full-time fire department, and other times where the closest fire departments may have 1 or 2 full-time staff and the rest are volunteers. And jurisdictions are signing off on that the public services are available. But to what extent do we understand how you would address a fire like this? Not that it would be any more severe than any other fire you might experience. But there might be things that somebody on scene would have to know to address this. What kind of training are the people getting? I mean, particularly if they're volunteers, you know, what kind of training are they getting? Do they know if they show up, what to do? And, you know, if they have 8 or 9 permanent staff for the facility, maybe 3 of them are on duty, to be honest, if I was optimistic during the day. But that's more my concern, actually.
I think that's a very, very good point, and it absolutely, I would expect emergency preparedness to be something that developers would be working with the local, you know, fire or lack thereof, resources, to ensure that there's an adequate and trained and prepared response available. One thing to note though about the lithium especially is that there's literally nothing you can do. So all of the mitigation and whatnot occurs beforehand, right? So once there is a thermal runaway, it's so hot that there's nothing you can spray on it. It has to literally exhaust itself. Yeah. So people would need to know that, right? People would need to know that I shouldn't try to stop this from burning out, right? But there's definitely some education that would need to take place. I mean, especially with these, you know, super large installations, right?
Councillor Byer?
With the preface that this is not a make work exercise, we have direct direction from the legislature that BESS can be included in any of our facilities. We have standards dating from the 1970s and 80s that did not anticipate these kind of facilities within facilities. Is there any need to think about additional standards or within our existing standards, additional conditions as we approve these facilities? These facilities are necessary. We understand that. We understand that technology is changing, but how do we, as a council, as a department, start addressing some of these knowns and unknowns that weren't anticipated when FSEC was created? So it's just something to put in the back of your brain to think about how we address this, some of the concerns about emergency preparedness, those kinds of things, but also involving the public as we start talking about, and by the way, there are going to be 20 containers full of batteries on the project. So thank you also for the presentation. I love the charts that sort of tell us this is where the money goes, and these are the pros and cons of different technologies.
And this is Sarah Esterson, Council Secretary. Just wanted to loop back. It's related to what you're saying and to your question. If you remember that Kellen Tardy-Weather gave a presentation in March, presenting these templates that we've produced for construction and operational wildfire mitigation plans, and a training requirement with the first responders. Like, it's the certificate holder's responsibility to offer these trainings, as well as let them know exactly what's on site. How do you get on site? I mean, even you might even have an agreement to have them have keys to get on site, equipment they can use just for them. So it's built into the templates, the specific on training. So that's coming through. I mean, these templates are just ever evolving as we learn more. So I think conditions are kind of coming through that wildfire mitigation plan as it relates to risk, and the wildfire prevention and wildfire suppression and prevention standard. I'm forgetting exactly what the standard says. Is like the closest to risk assessment, but I still feel like we don't have a standard that requires, let's say, an evaluation of public health and safety risk from thermal runaway, you know, so we don't have a risk assessment of worst case if the thing catches on fire in the way that, but we have the wildfire standard.
services.
Kind of, yeah. And we have some interesting comments coming through from rural fire protection districts on facilities with large batteries. So we're trying to dig in and see like what, because the typical evaluation under public services at its most basic is for fire protection, like is the facility in their service territory? Yes, good to go.
But I think public services is another one of our standards through which we could start imposing conditions, the two types of training conditions that are.
Oh, but we already, yeah, right, absolutely. And then Chair Howe, I think Council Member Grail has her hand up. Oh,
Counselor Grail.
Yes, good morning. I just wanted to say, Tom, thank you for tackling this topic. I don't know that that's what I would do for fun, but I appreciate the information. I think it's going to be something to help us have a baseline and to reassure the public that we are, being educated and able to ask better questions, because this issue, as I said in my written comments, I think communities need to be prepared and have a good understanding. Most importantly, everyone needs to be speaking apples to apples and not creating unnecessary confusion while we know some of the baselines. So again, thank you for the presentation. Really appreciate it.
I will just add one last thing. We are, as we talked about at the beginning of the year, forecasted to kind of go through all the council standards over the next couple of years. And we are definitely going to be thinking about new technologies and old technologies that don't exist anymore that we did, cared about in the 70s, and whether or not those changes should be reflected in the standards to the extent that they couldn't just be covered in new conditions under the existing standards. So we are definitely thinking about this kind of stuff.
Thank you, Mr. Jackman. Excellent job. So this is probably a pretty good time to take a break. Does the council feel it is? Okay, let's do that. 15 minutes? And that'd have us back about, call it 10:15. Okay, we'll break until 10:15. Okay, it's now 10:15, and I would like to call the meeting back from recess and continue with our next agenda item, which is public comment. This is an information item. This time is reserved for the public to address the council regarding any item within council jurisdiction that's not otherwise closed for comment. And please note that the Obsidian Solar Center Amendment 2 draft proposed order is closed for comment. Let's see, we've set the amount of time for individual commenters at 7 minutes, but let's see how many people we have that are wanting to comment. Nancy, could you see how many? Well, first of all, do we have anybody present that wishes to comment? Okay. And then Nancy, how many are on the webinar and on the phone that want to comment?
At this point, I just have one person with their hand raised.
Okay.
Why don't we just go ahead and remind everyone how to participate if they are so inclined? So if you are on the webinar, at the bottom of the main window, is a set of icons. You're going to click on that participant window. And at the bottom of that window is a hand icon. Click on that hand, that will raise your hand, and then click it again when you're finished with your comment. If you are participating on the phone, press *3 on your telephone keypad to raise your hand, and then press *3 again to lower your hand. All right, so I just have a Wendy King with her hand raised. Wendy, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your mic. You are ready for your comment.
Hear me, please?
Yes. We can hear you, Ms. King.
King, WENDYKING. I live in Redmond, Oregon. I just was listening in on the battery storage, and I was following the comments at the tail end of that. concerning fire mitigation. And I just need you folks to know that when you cite these projects, which require battery storage in Morrow County, that you're putting them next to dry land, croplands. And where a fire in a city may be comparable, I don't think it really is truly comparable because of our dryland nature and our tender dry fuels. So my question to you is what is the margin around these buildings? If the fire is too hot for fire suppression and it has to burn out, I'm very concerned about our croplands next door or maybe 100 feet away. What we need to do is, first of all, contact the fire suppression people. And for instance, in the case of B2H, they have attempted to contact our fire suppression people, but we visited with our fire chief, and quite frankly, he hasn't been in any dialogue with Idaho Power. So when we have cumulative impacts from a variety of basically possible ignition, how are we protected? How are our croplands and our livelihoods protected? And I appreciate your listening to my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. King. Nancy, is there any other hands up or star?
There are no other hands raised at this time.
Okay, we'll give it a minute and okay. I think we'll call it. We'll close the public comment period and move to the next item, which is the role of electricity transmission in the energy transition. This is an information item. Jason Searman, a senior policy analyst, will provide us an overview of this item, and he's on his way probably. Yeah, we'll just hold.
We can't hear online. I think the room is muted.
Thanks, Katie. I was just trying to figure out if it was me.
Okay. Thank you. There we go. I can hear you now.
Keep going. Okay. All right. Not sure where I was at, but we'll just pick it up here. I mean, I think it's helpful for everybody to hear this analogy, so I'll repeat it. The transmission infrastructure is very similar to how roads connect our cities and transportation system together. So transmission lines are the infrastructure that connects the power grid together. So there is basically no grid without transmission. And the primary value of having a robust interconnection of roads, as most people probably realize, or transmission lines in this case, is that robust networks enable broad diversity and competition in the marketplace. So there is no power market without transmission lines. Transmission lines enable markets and allow them to operate. In other words, a core value of robust transmission infrastructure is enabling a robust power market, which allows a broad diversity of customer demand for electricity to be served by a broad diversity of electricity supply technologies. And more diversity in supply and demand promotes more reliable, resilient, and affordable electricity service. So at its simplest, this is kind of an introductory slide here. The big picture takeaway is that transmission bolsters grid diversity and all the benefits that come with diversity. Next slide. Oh, great. We have the animation too. So am I able to actually do that? Okay, so here we go. So this is just a snapshot basically of the primary common themes driving the need to expand transmission infrastructure across the state and the region. We have electricity load growth. What is that? Well, population growth. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, you probably realize there's more people in your city on those roads. And like I just made that analogy, more people on roads, more people in your city. Well, the electricity demand doesn't come from nowhere, right? It's people. It's us. That's where the demand comes from. It also comes from data center growth. You've heard that in the news. Pacific Northwest is a very attractive spot for these data centers to locate. We've seen explosive growth in this sector. Weather, even that can increase our demand, right? Hotter days, colder winter days. Those are happening in peaks. It gets hotter heat waves and colder cold snaps and more freezing spells here in the Portland area or Oregon. We had the whole state under ice that one year. So it might be like getting a little warmer annually, but we have these periods where it's hotter and colder. And that means we have to meet those peak demands. So those are really probably the biggest drivers right there. The first one, that's why I started off with those. Extreme weather events kind of trickles into that, like I just explained. And then you have the clean energy and climate policies, which kind of create this additional, here we go, let me catch up here. So here's what I'm sequencing kind of the big drivers as, and you can see the clean energy and climate policies here. Well, what does that mean? Well, oops, it's like adding additional load growth, right? And whether we needed these EVs or not, like people are buying them because they're saving money on gas, right? I mean, it's an economical motivation here, not just these clean energy policies. So next slide, that's kind of the overview. Before exploring the power markets that I alluded to earlier, here's a foundational graphic or two to help ground us in all the basics about the physical nature of the power grid and the role of transmission. So let's break down how the grid is physically designed and how it functions. So looking at the right, you see an illustration of how transmission lines create a networked system that connects and delivers these large volumes of diverse supplies of electricity to meet large volumes of aggregated customer demand for electricity. Homes, businesses, and industry all create an aggregated customer demand. High quality bulk scale generation creates the most affordable supplies of electricity. And transmission infrastructure creates the network system that allows electricity to travel and flow to customers at close to the speed of light to meet their demand. And then looking at the left, we see the country's three interconnections. So yes, contrary to what many may think, the country isn't powered by just one single power grid connecting, California's electricity to New York's electricity, for example. These three interconnections are shown separately because they mostly function as individual power grids. An interconnection is more or less what it sounds like, a vast area of transmission infrastructure that interconnects dozens and dozens of individual power systems to create one very large network of diverse customer demand and diverse supplies of electricity generation. So some of the electricity can be transferred between these interconnections, but not much. You know, they enable the flow of electricity across the states and Canadian provinces. For example, in the Western interconnection, the red there up on the left, electricity can be shared in and out of Oregon and across all these other Western states. Electricity can be shared across many of the states in the Eastern interconnection. And then you have Texas, you know, it can basically share electricity with itself, right? But there is some limited ability to kind of get some electricity in and out. But you know, the somewhat infamous winter storm they had a few years ago illustrates kind of how they operate on an island. And the key takeaways here are basically, you know, 3 power grids, the large diverse loads and transmission infrastructure that connects them, and the fact that it basically creates the power grid as we know it. Next slide. Thank you. So again, one of the primary roles of transmission is to connect and deliver large volumes of diverse, high quality, low cost supplies of electricity generation to meet large aggregated volumes of diverse customer demand for electricity. This map of electricity transmission shows how transmission is built out to connect places like large cities and large industrial facilities to places where large volumes of electricity can be generated inexpensively. So we can explore where and why the transmission system has been built out over the years and the role it plays today by inspecting these maps of the Western interconnection where Oregon is located. Starting off with just, you know, the system here in the center. So we see a snapshot there of what it looks like and where it reaches. These heavy red lines are heavy duty 500 kilovolt AC lines that are the backbone of the Pacific Northwest system. Generally, any lines over 230 kilovolts are considered high voltage and compromise the bulk power grid. You can see all the red in the Pacific Northwest, showing that most of the bulk transmission system in the Pacific Northwest are these large 500 kilovolt lines. And these large lines are big and primarily concentrated up here in the Pacific Northwest because they deliver the vast amounts of clean, cheap hydropower resources that are relatively unique to the Pacific Northwest region. In fact, many energy resources are location dependent to some extent or another, not just hydropower. For example, coal-fired generation facilities are often located near a large coal mine to reduce costs of transporting coal far distances. And we can see in red and green here on this map that more transmission lines were developed to access these coal-rich regions in Montana and Wyoming. So the takeaway is that major transmission paths across the West were developed to access large electricity resources like hydro, coal, nuclear, and natural gas generation facilities to meet the large aggregated volumes of customer demand for electricity, including large population centers, large industrial customers, and all the smaller customers everywhere in between. So nearly all this transmission was built prior to the 1980s, well before modern renewable technologies like wind and solar had advanced to be cost effectively and widely commercially available as they are today. Let's sprinkle these in here. So, you know, I just kind of tried to illustrate the grid we have today, right? And that was built, like I just said before, we kind of developed these technologies, which are just cheaper these days, the wind and the solar. And guess what? I mean, the wind and solar is located in different spots than where the coal and natural gas and hydropower was located. And so, you know, the big takeaway here, I guess, is that there isn't enough transmission infrastructure built across the West to access the large, vast amounts of clean and cheap solar and wind resources needed to power the economy, keep the lights on, and meet the clean energy and climate policies in the fastest, most effective manner. Slide. Let's see here. Wait, scooch one ahead here. There we go. Okay. Oops, maybe we want. It's kind of the same slide, but a little bit different focus. So keeping with the analogy of how roads allow people and goods to flow around the country and enable diverse trading markets, transmission lines allow electricity to flow across regions of the country and enable regional power markets. So what's a power market? You know, I kind of explained it before, but we'll get a little bit more detailed here. There are different ways power markets can be designed, but all power markets effectively control how the transmission system within the market footprint is used to buy and sell electricity. Markets offer a contractual system that accounts for how much, where, and when electricity is injected and consumed across the grid. So where it's put into the grid and where it's taken out, where we use it. Contractual accounting of market transactions can help inform a basic understanding of how electricity flows across the grid, but it's important to know that power contracts and market operations don't actually control the physics of how electricity flows on the power grid. So as we can see here, different regions have different market paradigms for buying and selling electricity. There are regions where a fragmented bilateral market paradigm exists, and there are regions where a centralized market paradigm exists. Where the market is fragmented, a formal mechanism doesn't exist for utilities to pool, integrate all their assets together for common use and to maximize efficiencies. Utilities individually serve their customers' demand by scheduling the operation of their own generation and storage resources, and they operate their own individual transmission systems. Utilities buy and sell electricity with each other, but transactions for electricity are mostly through bilateral contracts, just between two entities, for example. A key aspect of the areas where fragmented bilateral transmission and markets exist is that there are more than 30 individual transmission systems across the bilateral West. I'll have a slide that just kind of illustrates that a little bit more effectively, and more than 20 individual transmission systems across the bilateral East. Those are called out here, just at a general level. This means when utilities in the bilateral West want to sell, buy, or transfer power long distances, they often need to navigate multiple different transmission systems. We can't see all these systems on this slide here, but we can see the 7 RTOs. So those are the colored regions, and those function as a single transmission system, right? So I'll illustrate this a little bit better here in another slide. And then we can explore transmission service rights, which is a whole nother kind of subtopic here. And that kind of implicates these terms that you maybe have heard: wheeling power across multiple different transmission systems. We'll talk about that. But the bottom line, I guess, is that buying and selling across multiple different transmission systems requires additional processes and additional transmission costs compared to transferring power just across one single system. Okay, so the next slide here is the same, but I'm just going to talk a little bit more about these regional transmission organizations. These are all the colored footprints here. These are centralized power markets under a single transmission system. Centralized markets offer a formal structure for utilities to work together to maximize efficiencies of existing generation, storage, and transmission infrastructure. Utilities pool their customers' demand and pool their resources and transmission systems into a centralized market, and an independent entity schedules operations of all the participating resources. So participants buy and sell electricity in these centralized markets by bidding into that independent operator's market pool, and the lowest cost bidders are then paid to operate at the levels they need to meet the aggregated demand of all the utilities. So they aggregate their demand too. That's, they aggregate all the resources, all the transmission is pooled together, and all the demand. And so they're operating the whole system in a unified, optimized fashion. So the key takeaways here are that these areas with centralized power markets are more efficient. They use the resources and infrastructure more efficiently compared to the areas with bilateral markets. And in centralized markets, it's an independent entity, also a key feature that schedules the operation of the resources, not the owners of the resources themselves. Centralized markets are a core feature of RTOs. That's why you hear about them so much. But you can also have centralized markets without participating in an RTO, something that maybe you've also read articles about, okay? These are centralized markets that are being offered by CAISO, for example, or SPP to utilities across the West right now. And we can talk more about these and the implications of those in a few more slides too.
Jason, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I have a question.
Yeah.
I better ask it now while it's
Go
still
for
in my head. So we often hear from developers that they might need more time to complete construction or to get into operations because they're in line, they're in queue with Bonneville to get their power onto the grid.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any evidence that if we had an RTO rather than a bilateral or fragmented system that developers would be able to get their power onto the grid more quickly than they can here?
That's a good question. Like everything, kind of depends. It's complicated. That would certainly eliminate one barrier, right? I think the picture will be a little bit more clear, but you know, I did show on that other map where it's windiest and where it's sunniest. So that's kind of another factor.
Sure.
And it's not just that, then you have to add in the expense of expanding the transmission to get to those resources. But, you know, the theory is you expand the transmission in state and other states expand their transmission in state, and then you've got this bigger network of wider roads across all the states. And so you are able to access that solar in Arizona, maybe, or the wind in Wyoming. And it travels so fast, right? But the transmission service rights and RTO issues and these queue issues, they're all interraveled, but also layer on like the resource quality, high quality. That's what I mean when I say high quality. Hydro, right? We have high quality hydro up here because it rains a lot. There's high quality solar, a little bit in northern or southern Oregon and Nevada, but it's really rich down in Arizona, and there's different load profiles too. So for example, if you have states in New Mexico and Arizona, Texas, I suppose, but that's limited transfer capacity, right? The way things are structured today. California, all these places where it's sunnier and it gets hotter than Dickens in the summer, right? Like they're going to be building solar because it's cheap, but also matches when people turn on their air conditioning during the day, right? And then in the winter, guess what? It's going to be cooler down in those spots, but they're going to have all this solar capacity built. And so solar's already inexpensive. What happens when they don't even need it? It's basically free almost, right? And we could tap into that. So there's just all these trade-offs with where the resources are located, how much transmission you have to build to access them, and all these things.
Thank you.
Yep.
Vice Chair Condon?
Thank you. Just to follow up, I want to make sure my understanding is clear. So even it might be better with an RTO, but you still have to have that large transmission line. And in this part of the country, it's vulnerable. And so somebody'd have to step up like B2H to put more transmission line.
Yeah, here we go. How about
Okay,
we go through this
Okay.
and see
Head on it.
see if that helps. Yeah, okay. So before shifting to, I'm not even sure what topic was going to be next, but maybe there's art to that. So, you know, one of the biggest takeaways here is that centralized markets alone, you know, without a large enough footprint and without an RTO, don't always solve a few of the biggest challenges facing the power grid these days, which I think is just getting to your question, which is how to plan and allocate the cost of expanding the transmission system most efficiently and cost effectively for ratepayers. So breaking this down, in the absence of an RTO, you can have a centralized market, but that alone doesn't resolve the challenges of fragmented transmission planning and cost allocation. So these are the two big challenges preventing the most efficient and cost-effective expansion of transmission from being planned and then also financed. It's important to remember most of the existing transmission system was built over 100 years ago when these modern technologies weren't available. So today, these technologies are often, you know, wind, solar, batteries. These modern technologies, so to speak, are prevailing as the least cost commercially available resources that can be built quickly enough to meet surging demand, keep the lights on, and achieve the clean energy and climate goals as fast and as cheap as possible. And their costs are projected to continue to decline, right, as their global and domestic market shares increase. They're just a fraction of what we use. So if you build more and use more, it's going to get cheaper, presumably. That's like market theory, right? And so there are many signs pointing to the need to expand transmission into these locations where low-cost wind and solar are. And the RTO paradigm does more to help address this than the fragmented transmission planning and cost allocation challenges that persist. Even if you had a centralized market, you know, you still have these independent transmission. I haven't shown you good graphics yet. It'll all be more crystal clear. And so the RTO, you know, it's the same independent entity that runs the market and it conducts the transmission planning. So it's doing both at the same time, right? So you have this optimized vision where you're running the market and you're kind of quote unquote running the transmission system, but you're planning for how to expand it, right? With this kind of top level viewpoint. So centralized transmission planning across large footprints helps maximize the efficient use of the infrastructure, right? And it minimizes the need for additional expansion. That's a key point too. Centralized planning can also help identify larger projects that benefit customers in many utilities right? So in other words, when it comes to larger projects, it's harder for one utility to identify all the benefits to customers outside of its own utility. This makes it harder to monetize the value and allocate all the costs of larger projects to all the customers who benefit from them. And with less certainty around benefits and cost allocation, it's difficult to secure the financing necessary to build the larger transmission projects that could provide more value. Okay, so now, I mean, I've built it up enough, so we might as well look at some of these. So circles of control, I'm kind of like, you know, bringing a little levity there. But we have all these circles here. What are they showing us? They're showing us the 7 RTOs, okay? And while I walk us through this big picture of the transmission systems, keep in mind that large volumes of high quality, low cost supplies of electricity are location dependent, right? So in general, transmission systems with larger footprints can access more diverse resources. Okay, so our last slide, this showed the 7 RTOs. This is each of those is a single transmission system. Then outside those RTOs, this graphic also shows all the fragmented systems across the Western Interconnection and that Southeast region. Let's highlight them here, right? So there's more than 30 of them in the West and more than 20 of them in the East. And, you know, the key takeaway here is look at how big the footprints are for the 7 RTOs, especially relative to all the smaller circles. As we discussed on the last slide, RTOs reduce frictions for transferring power across vast distances and transmission lines owned by different entities. BPA in the Pacific Northwest has a relatively large, you know, big footprint. It's hard to see here. I can show that better on another slide. But as we guess you alluded to, somebody talked about, BPA is not an RTO, right? And BPA's transmission system doesn't extend into as many areas of high quality solar and high quality land-based wind compared to the quality of solar and wind, you know, found in the Texas region, for example, or SPP in MISO. That whole area in the middle of the plains, the Midwest plains, you can say, is very, very resource rich in solar and wind. And I'll even show that in better visibility here in another slide. Let's go see what the next slide is. Could we go ahead one? There we go. All right. And let's just keep it here for a second. So here we can see, you know, those 30 fragmented transmission systems in a little bit better relief, right? They jump out a little bit easier. And we can also see how large BPA's transmission footprint is, right? That gray area up and to the left, or beige, or whatever it looks like to you, BPADs is what I'm looking at. So the benefit with this map is it's easy to see, you know, the big key takeaway that outside the RTOs, you have multiple transmission systems and how they could be barriers to accessing these distant and diverse low-cost sources of generation. This is because you have to navigate these multiple processes, right? Each one of those areas is its own process. And not only the process aspects, then you have to actually acquire the substantive like transmission service rights, right? Kind of like if you're ever driving on a toll road out east, you can get like these passes and you just go across all the roads instead of having to pay segmented tolls across every road. Then you get to another gatekeeper and you have to pay a toll to get access his roads and access the next person's roads. That's kind of how the transmission system works today with all these fragmented systems. So you have to get these transmission service rights to wheel power across these multiple systems. Each transmission system charges individual and unique transmission service rates. And then these rates can stack on top of each other. Here's another term you may have heard, pancake rates, right? That's no mystery behind that. It's just stacking them up on top of each other like pancakes. And this can cause the wheeling charges to be, you know, cost prohibitive. So another key takeaway is that each transmission system shown conducts its own transmission planning, right? So then not only do they have their own transmission operations in how they do their transmission service rights, but they do their own planning. So fragmented planning doesn't identify the most efficient expansion. Fragmented utility by utility, regional expansion, right? I mean, if you're just looking at your utility, you're going to optimize and plan the most efficiently for your utility footprint or your transmission system's footprint, but you might not be doing it in like the most, you know, holistic, high level fashion for the whole region. And then the other thing I talked about was the fragmented utility by utility planning. You know, they might not have enough large enough rate base so that's customers, right? To finance the larger, longer transmission projects compared to an RTO that benefits from all the aggregated customer load, all the demand, the whole bigger rate base, and they could just have a little bit, you know, bigger footprint, more customers. It just helps finance. So the main point on this slide is to appreciate, you know, the fragmented transmission systems. And then I've talked about them. So here we go. I'll start talking about them and show you guys some examples just to help illustrate what I'm talking about. So it may seem like a little bit of a mystery, right? What are these transmission service rights? So this is also going to be very high level. It's a lot more complicated than this, but this hopefully just helps illustrate. So, you know, within each of these balancing authorities, let's look at the Bonneville BPAT Balancing Authority. That's what all those letters stand for. You know, where was I at? So let's first imagine this line, you know, in the Bonneville area. Okay, we'll sprinkle in a little transmission line. And we'll put in a big red power line. What is that? That's a 500 kV line, right? We talked about that earlier. A 500 kV line is equivalent to 1,500 megawatts, okay? So figuratively, if we imagine looking into this large 500 kV line, or better yet, if we looked at like, you know, the transmission service records, like the actual accounting that BPA has, we'd see multiple entities holding unique transmission service rights on this line or pathway. For example, BPA, right? They might retain transmission service rights for half of the line's total capacity for their hydro system. PGE could acquire some on that line to deliver, you know, the electricity from their resources out in the gorge. Or other independent generators could, right? In generator one, like somebody has to buy. So Patrick asked a question about, you know, why don't these projects get built? Well, a lot of them don't have transmission service rights. There is a generator, generator one in the FSEC queue. Maybe he doesn't have that little slice of the pie yet. So he can't sell his power. No power contract, right? And the holders of these transmission service rights can use them to transfer power, you know, from point A to point B, like I just described. You know, you can walk through an example from Arizona to Bonneville. You can see all the different systems it would have to cross, right? Or they can sell those transmission rights to others. You know, we don't probably need to walk through another example, but Pacificor, Pac Power, they've got different monikers. There's an east and a west. You can see their east is the green area, right? PACE. And then Pac West is more Oregon centric. So, you know, they have big lines too. Same deal. 500 kV line in Pac's territory. Got our little trivia pursuit piece here. You know, maybe the same deal, right? They retain some for their big generators, their big resources. Other people can buy transmission service rights on the Pac lines. Okay. You know, I kind of went over it pretty quickly, but you know, that's basically it. I was going to walk through an example of Arizona to Bonneville, but you could see it's like 3 or 4 things. So, you know, that's what the pancake rates are, right? That's what the wheeling charges are. You have to contract with 4 or 5 different people. Maybe they have some transmission service available. Maybe they don't. You know, you just kind of have to run the gauntlet across all these different transmission providers. And then I just have like, this is basically my last substantive slide.
Go ahead.
But, so this is, I mean, here you go again, right? And I talked about that power alley. I don't know what you want to call it. That's kind of a jargony term you hear in the industry, but the plains, right? Look at where all the solar and wind is at, you know? So I've highlighted, you know, where it's solar, where it's sunny, where it's windy, and where it's both. And I even have some more fun Bob Ross stuff here to share. Except this thing's out of batteries. But if you just want to hit it like maybe 4 or 5 times, you can kind of see where it's sunny, or, you know, you can do it slowly and I can talk about it, but can you advance it a couple? Okay, so there's the sun popping up in the desert Southwest. Keep going. Can you advance it a couple more? Yeah, you know, so there's some Southern Oregon, right? That's where Lakeview and Klamath, you guys have project popping up there. You guys have solar project popping up in the gorge, maybe not because it's sunny, but that's because where the transmission's at, right? Yeah, and so, I just sprinkled in the wind right up in the plains. That's where it's windy if you've ever been over there. There's nothing to stop the wind. Sun down in Texas and windy, right? So the SPP stuff is over there. Yeah, you can go ahead and just click through all of them. It might be distracting, but we'll just go through it. But before looking at those charts on the right, oops. It's not like the Pacific Northwest doesn't have anything, right? Like we've got a strong, clean, renewable called hydropower that we've developed it, right? There's room for more. There's solar you can add in Oregon. There's value to it. It brings diversity. It provides resilience. It provides power. It can provide revenue, to farmers. It can do all these things, jobs. It has all those values. But I'm just illustrating here, the big picture, right? And then since we're looking at the wind, right? The other spot where it's windy is out in the ocean. And so you have California trying to do Herculean efforts with massive scale floating offshore wind. Oregon's been investigating the same idea for a few years. As a state, our utilities have been trying to model it and just see how it pencils out, right? So, that's the big picture. And then, the EDAM, that's what they call, that's what CAISO calls it, electricity or extended day ahead markets. I'm sorry, it's called extended day ahead market, EDAM. And Markets Plus, that's the SPP offering. I'm just using those because those are the topics du jour in the news today. Those are the efforts that are trying to put forward these centralized markets. Centralized markets are going to have footprints based on who joins the market, right? And so let's walk through the markets, right? So the key with markets is kind of the same with the RTOs. It's the size and shape of the market's footprint that is going to kind of provide the value, right? So there's big questions you have to ask when you're looking at a market. First, is the market footprint big enough to maximize the diversity of low-cost, clean electricity to serve ratepayers? And is the footprint big enough to ensure the markets are bigger than the weather? When you're talking about renewables, it's not always sunny and windy. There's clouds, there's storms, there's winter, but you have to be bigger than the weather to mitigate the risks of energy shortfalls, especially during extreme events. So the largest footprints are best for accessing diverse resources. Two footprints for two different centralized markets across the West are likely to provide less diversity than one large footprint, trying to illustrate that there. Does the market have a contiguous footprint, or are there gaps in the footprint that create transmission seams? Maybe that's another word people have heard. Ideally looking for footprints that blanket over as many individual systems as possible. You want to avoid gaps in footprints that create transmission seams. This may sound like a new word, and it has different implications, right? There's different accounting systems and all when you start creating these divisions across transmission systems and markets. But it's essentially, at its core, you can think of transmission seams relating to that wheeling, right? Wheeling of power across different transmission systems that we already discussed. So a seam is essentially a term that's used to describe the locations on the transmission system where the footprint of one market ends and another begins. And seams are important to avoid because they tend to increase the complexity and cost of acquiring transmission services needed to exchange electricity across those seams. So, in other words, a seam is likely to introduce higher transmission costs, which can be a financial barrier that prevents one market from accessing lower cost electricity located in another market. I guess it speaks for themselves. The other little three footprints there, you can just see, one's contiguous with no seams between the market, except there's a seam between the two markets, right? So that's the one in the middle. And then up to the right, the middle right, you see two markets, but you see discontiguous, non-contiguous markets with both of them. And then on the upper right is just your largest footprint, no seams, that could be an RTO eventually, but right now, everybody's just talking about markets without an RTO. But I guess I didn't talk about it, but if you have centralized markets, what happens is everybody pools their resources together, right? Kind of like an RTO. I already described it, but and then all those markets will pool together and they'll do the same thing, or all those resources will pull together. There'll be a market operator who will basically they'll bid into the market and they'll be allocated based on their lowest cost bids, right? Kind of like the most efficient use of all the resources. And then when they do those bids, they're pooling all their transmission service together too. So the winners of those bids of resources then get allocated whatever transmission they need to make that, to facilitate that transaction, okay? So the transmission is being optimized on these day-ahead bases for the market purchases that clear the auction, the winning bids of all the generators, whoever gets paid to operate, you know, the transmission system would be working as efficiently as those markets are. The difference is the transmission planning, you know, component is still going to be controlled by all the little, not little, all the smaller, all the fragmented transmission service owners, right? So they're still going to have control over the transmission planning, but the market day to day is going to be, you know, more optimized than it is today in the bilateral markets. That might not stick with everybody, but that's what's going on. And then, you know, here are the last couple slides. I don't probably need to talk about them, but I can entertain questions. So can we get to the next slide, Chase? So here I'm just providing some more information about in-process efforts, you know, to address. I talked like a little bit about transmission planning and a little bit about cost allocation, but these are all efforts that are kind of really aimed squarely at transmission planning and cost allocation challenges. And those are the two big barriers to more efficient expansion that RTOs can help address in ways that centralized markets alone cannot. So you have this West Tech study. Have people heard about that? I don't know. That is like looking at that whole top level view of the whole Western interconnection that we saw many pictures of. They're trying to identify, you know, actionable interregional, regional transmission projects that can help connect all these transmission providers and all the resources across the West most efficiently. But it's not really part of a formal RTO process. So they can identify projects, but it'll be up to everybody else, independent transmission developers, existing transmission incumbent providers like Bonneville or PacifiCorp. You know, they can look to this transmission plan study that'll come out of West Tech and then maybe grab projects that they might want to sponsor and put forward. FERC order, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission came out with a big order 1920, requiring folks to look out further into the future, 20 years to do their planning instead of 10 years. You know, states are going to be more involved in that planning process to some degree. Not sure how that's going to look right now. The CREPC Transmission Collaborative, that's a group of Western states that have been working together for decades. When I say states, like state government entities like public utility commissions, in some cases, departments of energy, state agency, energy offices, they've been working together for a long time. And what they're doing is collaborating together to kind of get all the states' feedback to push up into the FERC order 1920 process. So that's like Northern Grid, right? Northern Grid is our FERC order 1000 regional transmission planning entity, outfit. They're the folks that take all the transmission plans from PacifiCorp and PGE and Bonneville, all these local transmission plans. They all bubble up to Northern Grid every year, every 2 years. And then they kind of look at all the projects and they compare them side by side and see if there's any efficiencies that could be gained by combining or minimizing or doing something in different ways. But it's not really the top-down view, right? They take whatever projects are handed to them from these local providers and then do like a side-by-side comparison. So it does help optimize and help kind of reduce redundancy if there was ever any noticed, but we haven't had any regional projects ever identified through the Northern Grid process that I'm kind of fumbling around explaining very clearly, but all the projects that we see are from the local providers themselves. So B2H was a product of Idaho Power's transmission planning, right? It wasn't from Northern Grid. It rolled up into the regional plan of Northern Grid, and it was a regional project in that sense, but it wasn't like a priori identified like out of the ether from Northern Grid with like this top-down view, right? They didn't have this aha moment of like, oh, there's 4 different projects being put together by PGE and PacifiCorp and Idaho Power. Why don't we merge them into B2H, right? It was a project that was identified by Idaho Power, probably in partnership with PacifiCorp and Bonneville, you know. So there is collaboration. It's not just like a formalized collaboration that an RTO would do. So anyway, I think there's one more effort like these state transmission authorities. I have another slide that can kind of show people what that is at a high level. The legislation, to my knowledge, the recent news I got has failed, but Oregon and Washington both had legislation in this current legislative session to create state transmission authorities. But I think both of those efforts have, you know, missed a deadline or didn't get out of committee or whatever happened to them. But those would basically, you know, give some authority to states on transmission. And so we could do some state transmission planning as a cohesive state, or we could participate, you know, more formally with like some actual teeth in Northern Grid's process. I can participate in that. Currently, I have the PUC might monitor Northern Grid's ongoings, but we don't have like a state transmission authority or entity that's like putting forward projects into that. Like we're not identifying a B2H and then giving it to Northern Grid to analyze against these other projects, right? So that's an example. And then we could have bonding authority as a state, right, to try to develop transmission projects on our own, or, you know, put an RFP out, you know, have somebody else build a transmission line for us, or however that would work. But those are the big broad brush strokes of that. So I think I've used far more time. Sorry for the hiccups early on, getting us out of the gate, but.
Thanks for your presentation. My temples are pressing right now. A lot of information there, and it's very complex.
Question.
Vice Chair Condon, and then we'll go to Councilor Devlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'll end this with a question, but more of a statement. I've been exposed to this issue a fair amount. I mean, I spent 4 years on the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which I'm not going to go into great detail there, but it's an interstate compact planning for the power needs of Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Idaho. And when you look at how that was created after whoops, that's largely the reason it was created. They give all of these authorities, which seemed like 20 or 30 years before their time in terms of identifying future power sources. They were supposed to look at conservation first, renewables, and cogeneration, but that had to do with timber interests, and then finally fossil fuels. They never gave them any authority on transmission, none, zero. And their limited authority on power, direct authority, is actually just to the degree that Bonneville wants to acknowledge it, is to Bonneville. Their authority actually on other utilities is actually basically on the quality of the work that's done there. It's probably pretty good analysis of actual power needs. And then in the last few years, discussions here on some small work group that met discussing where our existing transmission lines are and where land would be that could be utilized for different purposes. And then 1 or 2 of the participants from some work group that Wyden and the governor put together, a transmission work group talking to them. But I think one of my best educations in this was attending Bonneville Power Administration rate setting hearings, both for their rates and actually for transmission. And I can tell you, in those particular, go away from the rate setting because you can imagine what that would be. But the transmission, all of these entities that depend upon that transmission, I would say maybe 80 to 90% not in favor of any significant improvements in the transmission system unless it directly benefits them. And I think one of the biggest questions in this is who pays? And everybody wants somebody else to pay. And it's very hard to actually figure out a mechanism that for some entities is going to be of any benefit, like in the PUDs and the co-ops and all. kind of view Bonneville Power as their power. So they don't really want Bonneville taking on too many more responsibilities if it impacts their rates. But I just don't know how you figure out this, how you're going to pay. I mean, you've got this thing with the transmission line we've been dealing with, but that's largely between a couple of major utilities. And I think how you do this so you don't also overestimate what the need is. Because transmission lines are not inexpensive. And you don't want to build them if they're not going to actually be utilized. So I think that's the biggest question out there. The other thing is there's been a lot of discussions with Cal ISO, and not to be critical, but the California legislature is kind of open to those discussions as long as they maintain absolute control over Cal ISO and it operates totally in the benefit of California utilities.
Well, and I've heard that conversation, that tenor might be shifting. I think labor has changed their perspective, you know, that was
Yeah.
a big advocate to keep the construction and the power projects in California. And labor, of course, wanted to see that, right? Because their union members would benefit. But I think there's legislation exactly kind of like our transmission authority bill. There's legislation everywhere on all sorts of power grid topics, but there is some legislation on that. And then, yeah, who pays is the ultimate question. I think as data centers and load growth start affecting more and more people, especially in consumer-owned utilities that are the primary Bonneville customers, you might see people identifying and realizing the need for transmission that maybe they didn't see before, coming to their areas that were all served by Bonneville, and maybe they didn't see a bunch of load growth and there was no need for transmission for everybody. Maybe everybody would just move into the city, right? And so that tension maybe got exacerbated over.
Well,
the years,
one
but-
of the underlying realities too, is you pointed it out there. California, now, not every jurisdiction in California is in, there are a few that are not actually, but California's just a hair under 40 million people. We're about 4.2. Washington's a hair under 8 million.
There you go.
Montana's 1.1. Idaho is finally is faster growing state, actually, 2 million. So altogether, those are about 15 million.
Yeah, and
Larger
you
land area
highlighted
than
the
California.
exact, you know, that can, everything's a pro and con, everything's a blessing and a curse, right? So, you know, I like to say, California's 10 times bigger. Oregon or Washington's twice as big as Oregon, right? And so the value is exactly that, right? So if you start banding together with other states, guess what? There's 40 million people in California that can help pay for projects. There's 8 million people in Washington that can help pay for projects.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be Oregon's smaller population paying for these big projects on themselves all alone, right?
Well,
And I talked a little bit about that, like the bigger rate base can help you finance these.
Well,
bigger
yeah,
projects.
if you can get people to agree, yes.
Yeah, it's based on the benefit, right? If you have a population that's demand 10 times
I
bigger.
mean, that's my
benefits
biggest
are gonna
question
be
is, how
stronger.
are you ever going to get people to agree on who pays? And there's another reality there too. I mean, I don't think like in Oregon's case that, you know, I have to go back a long ways. I think when I first entered the legislature, it was about the time of the meltdown in California over their deregulation of utilities, and had an enormous impact on Oregon and other states, but there was not much we could do about it. I mean,
Yeah, well, I think that might motivate people to, you know, lower their shields and have a little bit more open-mindedness to things. And what I'm getting at are crises, right? And so you highlighted a crisis in California. There's probably going to be some crises this summer with wildfires. There might be some more crises in different parts of the country that haven't had to deal with this. And when the lights go out, people are affected, and that can motivate some discussions and collaborations that maybe had barriers beforehand.
like you say, everybody expects when they flip the switch that there's going to be cars.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Counselor Grail?
Thank you. I just wanted to say, I just wanted to say, like Council Member Devlin, I've been dealing with this pretty much my entire previous job career, and these are complicated issues. I completely agree that it's control. I've sat through more meetings than I care to with a variety of folks, but pending on the players involved and the impact, it's an uphill lift. And Jason is correct. Nice to see you, Jason. He is correct about who's going to basically give, right? We have a need that we have to figure out how people are going to trust that it is a greater need for everybody, and it's not going to just be shipped in one place in space, and that somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. But the forward thinking to meet all of our objectives, we've been on this hamster wheel for a long time, and I don't see getting off of it anytime soon until something happens that we are absolutely forced to. So thank you for the thoroughness of your presentation. I really appreciate it because it's something I'm extremely interested in personally and professionally.
Vice Chair Condon.
Thank you. Thank you for the depth of this presentation, and we might have to come back 5 times and repeat it, but
It's recorded.
so as Councilor Rowe had mentioned before, is we get a lot of comments about needing to connect, and there's a wait for that. And I just want to make sure I understand correctly. For all this to work, the 500 kilovolt transmission lines are critical to be open. And if Bonneville, if it takes years to get the interconnect right, I guess, and then the facilities have to be built, it's 10 years out, right? I mean, it's a long runway.
Yeah, it's infrastructure, right? I mean, people talk about it as power plants and transmission lines, but it's infrastructure.
Right.
I mean, it takes a while to build a road. You only build them in the summer, right? It takes a while to plan them. It takes a while to, I mean, the roads are primarily built out, but it takes a while to acquire the rights, to go through, the benefit, I think, is that, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Well, what did we have? We had most of these power lines built in the 50s and 60s, right? I mean, that's the same piece of aluminum or metal or whatever that has been out there for 70 years. And I mean, just walking around your house or going down the aisles of a shopping store, you see the materials have changed, right? So if you reconductor lines in existing corridors and these existing transmission lines, which are a couple big projects that Bonneville is working on right now, PGE is working on these Bethel to Round Buttes, and what's the BPA, Big Eddy to Chemawa. These are crossing the Cascade Range, and they're reconductoring projects. So it's not a new, I don't think it'll ever even come to the Energy Facility Siting Council. But that's one way that you can efficiently expand and maybe bulk up. I think they're 230 lines, maybe they're going to bulk them up to 500 kV lines, right? So those are important. The existing ones we have, then we have to reach some new areas, right? So, how can we help increase certainty to Councilor Devlin's points about, okay, you don't want to build a bridge or a road or a transmission line to nowhere, right? So how do you increase the confidence and certainty that if we build this transmission line, there's going to be ability for these solar projects to get built, and the contracts would be, you could do like something called a renewable energy zone, for example. The state could help boost that certainty by identifying an area potentially where, it's sunny and it's maybe not, a slam dunk, but maybe, hey, here's an area where it's sunny. Take a look at this. We've identified it. The Department of Interior is doing something like this, like a programmatic EIS for their federal lands, right? To kind of get ahead of things, be like, hey, this has been pre-vetted. We're still going to have to go through all the check boxes and do our rigor and do our scrutiny, dot the I's and cross the T's. But at its core, we've pre-vetted this and we've done some homework already to help, give it a boost in this siting and permitting process, right? So that's one aspect. Utilities can do different RFP structures, right? So right now, those are structured in a way where these developers have to bring their own transmission. So that example in the pie piece, right? Looking down the transmission line, the generator currently has to go out and work with these entities and jump in line in these queues and deal with all that. And utilities would have to do the same thing, but utilities also have their own transmission rights, legacy rights. They can also buy more rights. They're more sophisticated. They have teams of transmission people working, like not just, Obsidian's 4-man team or whatever, right? Or 4-person team, right? They have, there's just different tools. But, the bottom line is you're just kind of chipping away around the edges of kind of a constraint by all these little things, but it all helps. But an RTO, if you get to an RTO, that's kind of probably going to be the most efficient, best way, quickest way to kind of spur things along. It's just how come we're not there yet? Well, because people can't agree to it, right? So there it is.
Counselor Byer.
So first, thanks to Counselor Devlin and Counselor Grail for sharing their perspective, because I know you've worked on these issues for a long time and the complexity is just mind-boggling. The fact that there is no sort of regional look plan to sort of think about what the future looks like is sort of concerning. As you showed, the interesting perspective that the project that we all worked on, B2H, was driven by the utility is somewhat interesting, not driven by an entity or any sort of regional planning. Thinking about who pays and who some of our bigger users are, and I know this is not popular, but the data centers are going to continue to be a drain on the system. And working with the renewable developers to establish that transmission that typically benefits the data centers. They aren't generally located in our huge population centers. Is just something to throw into the mix. But having some sort of regional planning structure seems like, why aren't we there? But, and I think Councilor Rowe nailed it. Our issue is just making sure the renewable developers who come to us have a place to sell their power. And that's kind of our interest, but the complexity of transmission is just mind-boggling for, us, for ratepayers and for other users.
Everybody's recognizing that, right? Like the data center load growth has popped this need for expansion up on everybody's radar across the entire West. So, a few things that are being done, right? Everybody's working on it. So that West Tech study, that's all the utilities across the West, maybe not all of them, but a good chunk of them. Bonneville, CAISO, California, right? The Montana transmission operator, they're all working together to do that study. And so that's going to give you a blueprint or hopefully some product that can identify some of these regional projects. The centralized markets, again, that's working. That's going to create a marketplace for these projects in Oregon, or at least on the drawing board for Oregon, to have a bet, not just, oh, hey, will you buy my power, one utility? Will you buy my power, one utility? No, they could put a bid in for all the utilities to buy their power. It'll be on a day ahead basis, so I don't know if that'll be enough to help them, with a long-term contract. It might have, it's all to be determined, but people are trying to chip away at this because everybody's seeing it. And the data centers, they can expand a transmission. They can pay for that. They can help pay for that. And when you go out and expand a transmission line, if you've got somebody who's going to pay for 80% of it or 100% of one transmission expansion, if you expand it even bigger, and then that 100% turns to 80%, then all they need to do is find a buyer for the 20%, right? So having big buyers and big entities and aggregated demand and centralized, it all helps swallow the financing challenge. Yeah, and digest that.
Okay, tell us how the rest.
Yeah. Well, it'll be, as we also talked about, it's like watching grass grow sometimes, but
Counselor Devlin?
Thank you. This is an unfair question to actually give you right now, maybe for a future response. One of the things that analysts at the Northwest Power Council would talk about is how Bonneville markets its transmission capabilities and how, if they marketed it differently, the system could actually accommodate actually a higher level of true usage. Because what they do is they sell a certain amount of transmission at a certain time. I think there is, in a sense, an informal secondary market because people are buying from others,
Yep.
but there's no real formal secondary
there's
market.
another, Bonneville just in the past few months has paused its queue. Maybe you've heard this.
Yeah.
It's talked about as some of the other news stories I've mentioned, but the Bonneville queue is frozen, right? I think you can come in, maybe you can still submit your
Yeah.
request, but they're not processing anything because they're going through a process reform. So they are taking all this input. It's a public process. It just kicked off a couple months ago. It'll probably be a year, 2-year timeframe, but they're looking at a complete overhaul, maybe not the best words, but they're doing something
Yeah.
on a pretty big scale that hasn't been addressed or assessed or revised in decades.
Yeah.
And so everything's kind of changing with renewables to some extent. We didn't build out the system the way we didn't, like I already talked about, right? So, you just have to design the system for the problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
And
Well, hopefully they do
Yeah.
something else. I mean, their statements and their analysis said that they could actually accommodate a lot more than they're
yeah, I
currently
thought about adding
accommodating.
that to those bullets at the end,
Yeah.
but I put these slides together a while ago, so. But yeah, everybody's working on this. So it takes a village.
Well, it was very informative. Thank you very much.
Phil, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. So Chair Howe, this is-
Secretary Esterson.
Our next presenter, Hillary Foote, I believe she is leading a Rural Advisory Committee shortly, I think around noon. I don't know. Hillary, can you hear me? I just wanted to check with her. The next space is to get your lunch and then listen to the presentation. I think her presentation is like 15 minutes. So I just wanted to see
Yeah.
if we could just roll into it
Okay.
and then we can take a break.
Sure.
Is that, Hillary, how's your timing looking?
I think that would be great. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Okay, then the next item is the Department of Land Conservation and Development update on farm impacts test. It's an information item, and we have Hillary Foote, the farm forest specialist with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And good morning, Chair Howe, Vice Chair Kondo, council members. So I'm Hillary Foote, and I'm the Farm and Forest Land Use Specialist for DLCD. Thank you for having me here this morning. And I do have a slide deck if that's available. There we go. So I understand this morning the Department of Energy staff asked me here to brief the council on some rule updates that we have made that impact conditional uses proposed in exclusive farm use zones. So that's going to include power generating facilities when they're located on farmland. So what I'll do this morning briefly is provide some background on that rulemaking and then go through that particular rule change in detail. And that should take about 15 minutes. And I'd be more than happy to answer questions from the council at any time. So the 2024 rulemaking I'm talking about today is actually part of a multi-year program called the Farm and Forest Modernization Program that was initiated in response to a large volume of public comment our commission received throughout the first part of 2023. So we were hearing that there was a need to update various aspects of our farmland conservation program. The focus of the 2024 rulemaking was really technical in nature, and it's intended to improve the consistency of implementation by counties of the program, and to add some clarity needed to make that implementation a little bit easier on county planning staff. And I would clarify that these rules from the 2024 rulemaking were adopted and they became effective at the start of this year. And those updates are currently published on the Oregon Administrative Rule website. So that 2024 rulemaking was grouped into 3 parts. So in blue on the left, we have codification of common law. And that's going to include codification of case law on the farm impacts test, which is applied to power generating facilities that we're going to be talking about today. The other items in green there are primarily definitional items. And then lastly, in yellow, we had a couple of years worth of conforming rulemaking to catch up on. So that's essentially making sure that changes that were made to statute are also in our rules. So today I'm going to focus on the item that codified common law standards for what's known as the farm impacts test. So I'll say a few things about common law as it's applied in land use reviews, and then we'll move on to the farm impacts test. So common law is the body of law that's derived from court decisions. And under the American common law system, prior court decisions are really critical elements of subsequent court interpretation. So for example, about 5 years ago, there was an important land use decision in Yamhill County, and it was for a landfill expansion on farmland. And it's referred to in the planning community as the stop the dump case. So the decision in that case by the county was appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals, or LUBA, and that was appealed to the Court of Appeals and was appealed all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And we've now seen the holdings in that Supreme Court decision cited several times in new different land use decision appeals. And what is happening is that county issues a decision not based on the sort of common law standards that were evolved from that case. That decision's appealed to LUBA. LUBA sends these decisions back to the county or remands them to run the meetings process all over again with direction on the sufficiency of evidence and the findings that need to be made as they were described in the stop the dump decision. So that's an example of how common law influences subsequent court decisions. All right, so next slide, we'll move on to the farm impacts test. And I would actually just note that there's a really large body of case law standards underpinning the Farm and Forest Land Use Program. It's been a pretty controversial program. And there's some equity issues with that. So experienced planners, well-resourced jurisdictions who have the time to stay up on case law are familiar with these court holdings and they apply them to land use reviews. However, historically, these standards aren't codified in statute or rules, so they're not applied equally across the state. Counties have very different levels of resources to stay current on case law. So that can result in land use decisions that don't conform to those common law standards when the reviewing planner is not familiar with them. And that results in unnecessary legal challenges, and that's a waste of time and money, both for the county and for the applicant. All right, so that was some of the impetus for adopting this rule change. So the farm impacts test, next slide, please. So ORS 215-296, or the farm impacts test, as it's commonly referred to. This is a criterion that is applied to all conditional use reviews in exclusive farm use zones. So whether it's a dog kennel or a power generating plant. And this test is essentially a good neighbor test. So a little bit about EFU zoning, just a reminder, exclusive farm use zoning is applied to agricultural land in Oregon that is intended to be protected for farm use. There's a limited supply of good soil out there, and that zoning is applied based primarily on the capability of the soil or the suitability of that land to contribute to the type of agriculture occurring in a given area in Oregon. So in addition to farming, there are certain non-farm uses that are permissible on land protected under exclusive farm use zoning. But those uses are limited to those that have been identified by the legislature and are listed in statute in Chapter 215. And that list in Chapter 215 is divided into two parts. The first part is sub 1, we call it. And these sub 1 uses are uses that the legislature decided were compatible, so long as the standards in statute are applied. So that would include transmission lines. Counties have to offer these uses in their ordinance, and they cannot be more restrictive than what's in state standard. Then there's a second list of uses that we refer to as sub 2 uses. And that list includes uses that the legislature felt may or may not be compatible with farm operations in the surrounding area, depending on the specific property, the character of agriculture in the area, and the particular development proposal. So power generating facilities are in this category. And all sub 2 uses require a county to find that the non-farm development that's being proposed will not force a significant change in or increase the cost of accepted farm or forest practices in the surrounding area. So counties can choose not to offer sub 2 uses in their ordinance. And if they do choose to offer them, they can impose more restrictive standards. So that's why you're going to find slightly different local criteria being applied to power generating facilities depending on which county you're in. But the state criteria, which is the basic, and includes the farm impacts test, must be applied in all counties. All right, so if you look at the slide here, the original language for the farm impacts test is in black here. It mirrors the statutory language, and the new rule language is in red. So you note that the original language is fairly short, and you will notice that it's quite subjective. So the requirement is that counties find the proposed development will not force a significant change in accepted farm or forest practices on surrounding lands devoted to farm or forest use, and will not significantly increase the cost of accepted farm or forest practices on surrounding lands devoted to farm or forest use. So very subjective. It requires the county to exercise a lot of discretion in coming to that conclusion. So a good chunk of the new language here in red is quoted directly from the cases that were reviewed to support this rulemaking. And the proposed rule language here essentially describes the step-by-step actions required for an applicant or a county to reach a conclusion that the non-farm development that's being proposed won't force a significant change in farming practices or their costs. So if I'm an applicant, I'm going to start at the big A here. And the first step in preparing my application is to look at lands surrounding my proposed development. And I'm going to identify and describe the farming operations and forest operations occurring in the area and the practices that are occurring on those operations. So this one is pretty straightforward. If you don't know what's going on around you, you can't assess whether or not you're going to have a negative impact on your neighbors. All right, so the second step then is described in B here. So once you've identified those farming operations, you need to consider whether and how your proposal might impact your farming neighbors. So one component of the new language that is pretty significant here is clarification that significant means something that is likely to have an important influence or effect. And the import of this is essentially that this is the dictionary definition of significant. And it is a clarification that it is the ordinary meaning of significant that's being applied here. It's not some other specialized meaning. And it sort of reflects this idea that the crux of the statute is that farming activities are not going to be displaced by non-farm uses. They're not going to suffer from interference due to non-farm uses. In D, below here, we have also added a non-exhaustive list of the types of potential impacts that frequently come up during land use reviews. So this does not come from case law. The intention with including this list was to help an applicant think through the types of things that might be of concern for their farming neighbors, like traffic, water availability, water delivery, like irrigation canals, introduction of weeds, introduction of pests, damage to crops or livestock, litter, trespass, reduction in crop yields, and increased likelihood of flooding. Back up to C, and this is probably one of the more convoluted clarifications here, but in addition to identifying individual impacts to farm practices, the Stop the Dump case, that decision also included a discussion of how the farm impacts test treats cumulative impacts. And this is a little bit of a different meaning than we might normally think. So at issue in this case was whether the review involves the cumulative effect of the same impact spread across multiple farms in the agricultural area. So for example, whether, something that attracts nuisance birds, whether we're looking at the impact of that across the agricultural landscape, or whether the review requires an analysis of the cumulative impact of multiple different kinds of individual impacts to each separate farm. And in Stop the Dump, the Supreme Court concluded that it is the latter type of review that is required. We're looking at the pile-on effect, if you will, of multiple impacts that might not be individually significant, but may indeed be significant, may have a significant impact when you consider them all together. So the language here in C clarifies that this analysis looks at whether a bunch of different impacts to a single farm might have an important effect on their ability to conduct their farming impact practices. And it's important to note here that if significant impacts are identified, of course, the county may require mitigating conditions be implemented to address those impacts and move forward with approval. So as the council is very aware, it's quite common to see conditions of approval like maintaining vegetative buffers, fencing, posting signage, dust mitigation, or limiting hours of operation. So moving down to E, there is a clarification here that significant impacts to farm operations from construction activities are appropriate to consider as a part of the review. And this comes from the Von Lubken case. So for example, if a proposed development involved a shared access driveway through a farm, a farmer might be concerned about the impacts of construction vehicles driving over that shared driveway, like introducing noxious weed seed, introducing biological contaminants. They might be concerned about dust from that construction traffic on their crops. And so a county could conclude that those impacts are indeed significant to their operation and require mitigating conditions of approval, like spraying tires before they enter that section of the driveway. And lastly, F clarifies here that a jurisdiction cannot force an impacted farmer to accept financial compensation in lieu of mitigating those significant impacts. So the purpose of an exclusive farm use zone, right, is to ensure a safe space for farming, if you will. And the farm impacts test cannot be addressed by allowing significant detrimental impacts to farms to occur in exchange for financial compensation. So that was one of the conclusions that came out of that Stop the Dump case. So that is about it for me. Next slide. And actually another slide there. There is a lot of different information posted on other aspects of the rulemaking on our websites in various locations, but quite honestly, the easiest way to obtain additional information is simply by emailing me, and I'm happy to point folks to any information that might help them with that. So with that, now, Chair Howe, are there any questions? Happy to provide additional color.
Any questions from council? Doesn't look like it right now anyway.
I just-
Secretary Esterson.
Yes, thank you. This is Sarah Esterson. I just had a comment in case it wasn't clear, but because this is a conditional use requirement in EFU zone land, like this criteria applies to almost all of the projects that will be in front of you. And so you'll start to see this analysis come through. I think it became effective in January. So so as we've started to receive new, because land use has the goalpost rule, so that if a preliminary was already in, it wouldn't come through. So there might be some inconsistency, but you'll start to see it. And there is, because this is like a broad conditional use requirement, there is overlap in this evaluation with LCDC's rule that applies already to solar. So, I mean, it's like some new, some old, and we have been tracking that stop the dump case, and we have been trying to bring forward that through to you so that there would be consistency there. But there was pushback from developers to change the way that evaluation was done before, with it not being in rule. So this is really helpful.
Councilor Devlin.
We've asked this question, I think, several times over the last year about how we judge cumulative impacts. Does this provide us any additional guidance?
Thank you, Councilor Devon. So it depends on whether we're looking at which definition of cumulative impacts you are looking at here. So here it's clear that we're looking at we have to consider impacts practice by practice and farm by farm. The Supreme Court specifically left open the possibility that a party might argue that the test also requires a broader analysis, but they did not make any conclusion on that point in the Stop the Dump case. So if you are, asking a question about landscape level impacts to an agricultural community, or trying to look at sort of assess a tipping point question, that is really not addressed, in these rules. That's a question that it may still hang out there for argument.
Councilor Grail.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Councilor Grail. I saw the hand and I thought it was next to your
Did I
name.
leave
It's
it up?
actually, it's it's actually Councilor Ines.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. So, my question is, does this new rulemaking just for new projects that we're looking at in 2025 forward? Or are we going to be using this rulemaking when with other projects that come forward that are already built? So maybe if there was an amendment, then it would apply.
That's right.
Okay. But so for right now, basically anything new coming forward, this will be incorporated into our conditions.
That's correct. Yes.
Council Rowe, did you want to say something? Or add or not?
Well, it's as Sarah mentioned before, the
There's a lot
goalpost rule.
on how this will be. Pardon?
Go ahead, Councilor Ines.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation, Hillary. And I think there will be quite a few questions going forward surrounding this new rulemaking, though, as it's incorporated into our evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Councilor Imes. And I would just add that, DLCC staff are always happy to come and present to the council and answer any questions. And, we appreciate the close working relationship that we do have with Department of Energy staff on reviews. And of course, we're always available to answer questions for Odo staff as well.
Okay. Council Rowe, did you have anything to add or?
Looks like Councilor Byer has something.
Okay, Councilor Byer.
He said that with some trepidation, but thank you, Hillary. That was really helpful and a lot of clarifying language, but I am a little bothered by the notion of surrounding land uses. Is that adjacent farms and forests, or is that regional? I think we struggled with this in the West End case. And so it's kind of a loaded term for me, and seems like a developer or an applicant for any of these conditional uses could find themselves tied up. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Byer. So yes, so what is the surrounding, what are surrounding farm and forest operations? It's very similar to another question, what is the agricultural area at play? And this criteria applies again to all conditional uses and exclusive farm zones, whether it's a dog kennel or a power generating facility. So there can be a variety of impacts and a variety of scale. When you're talking about these types of uses, so it could be something that might have an impact that extends miles away, and it might be something that really, will have a limited impact depending on the type of development that you're talking about. And of course, these criteria apply across the state, and they apply in areas where, the agricultural lands tend to be more bounded by topography, like in the coast, along the coast, for example, where you're going to find agricultural areas that are sort of isolated by foothills, and it's a little bit easier to identify, what that surrounding agricultural area might be, as opposed to when you're talking about the eastern side of the state. So it is a criteria that is broad, and this is why there's an opportunity for local discretion here. To look at the particulars of what's going on in that particular site and make a discretionary decision as to what the extent of that impact could be. So I understand that it's something that we grapple with a lot, but that's the case for most of the reviewing authorities on these questions.
Thank you for that context. That's somewhat helpful.
Yeah.
Any other comments, questions?
Hillary, this is Patrick Rowe with the Department of Justice. You've already addressed cumulative impacts, but just want to make sure that, just want to clarify how DLCD is approaching it. My understanding, given the presentation and the new rule, is DLCD looks at cumulative impacts on what are the cumulative impacts of a proposed facility on adjacent farm or the surrounding farmlands. Meaning, for example, this facility is going to have traffic impacts, it's going to have impacts on water availability. Let's look at all of those cumulative impacts of that facility on the surrounding lands. It is not a cumulative impacts test where you're looking at, well, we have now approved 4 energy facilities in this county. What are the cumulative impacts of all of those facilities on agriculture? It is not the latter, correct?
That is absolutely correct. So, and it's a lot of people construe the phrase cumulative impact to mean that latter sort of analysis that you were talking about, that can involve some sort of, tipping point assessment. So this is something that would be applicable, for example, to a non-farm dwelling review where you are looking at dwelling permits that have been approved over time in an agricultural area and looking at the impact of all of those developments on the ability of that agricultural economy to function. So that's not what we're talking about here. So the impact analysis here and is practice by practice, farm by farm, and it's limited to the proposed development in question. So the individual solar farm, the individual dog kennel, and how that's going to impact farm operations and farm practices, not the landscape level look that would be appropriate in different types of reviews.
Counselor Devlin?
Thank you. This is just a question for our council. So we're not looking at that overall impact on agriculture within that area, the impact on individual properties. But let me give you what seems like a far-fetched example, but it may not be in the future. We have 2 projects operating, and we know what the impacts are of those. We've approved 2 more, but we don't know if they're actually going to be developed. We don't know if they're going to get financing. We don't know. Previous discussions, we're going to get transmission lines. I would assume if we get a 5th project, we have to assume that the 2 that we've approved but haven't been constructed are going to be constructed. Well, because we took in consideration their impacts. So we have to actually, let's say there was actually a road impact. We would actually have to consider them as the cumulative impact in that area.
But that is not an assessment that we do. We don't do that type of landscape cumulative impacts assessment.
Okay, but you would be doing the impact on, let's say, individual agricultural operations in the area that were adjacent.
Yeah, we do the type of analysis that Ms. Foote has just described.
Right.
But we do not currently do a type of analysis where we're looking at all of the facilities in a given area, and now you add one. Is there a tipping point?
Okay. Okay, it's close to one topic. I'm still looking at the specific impacts, but not the cumulative impacts. But I mean, we have to assume that what we have approved, if there's going to be additional impacts beyond that, we have to assume that those facilities are going to be constructed.
That's not something that we're looking at. Like, I'll give you a good example that I often think about when I'm reviewing impacts on. We look at, is there under the is it the public service, when one of our standards we look at housing availability ratings, that's under public services, right? To me, it might make sense to say, okay, well, we've approved 3 other facilities. Let's look at the timing. When did we approve for them to be built? Is housing really going to be available since they're going to be having their workers live in those hotels or in those trailer parks? Yeah. But that is not something that the standards currently ask us, that require of us to do.
But thinking one project we approved that probably have more need for housing than existed in the entire area in terms of available housing. Another project occurring at the same time might have that impact.
I understand the point you're making, and that example I provided is maybe one of the easiest cumulative impacts analyses that you might be able to run. But under the other standards, and this is a topic for a whole separate discussion, but trying to do a cumulative impact assessment for the other standards that we have could become very problematic. Yeah. Could become very speculative.
Any other comments? Seeing none. Ms. Foote, thank you for your presentation.
No, thank you, Chair Howe.
And I guess at this point, we're ready to grab lunch. We'll take a 15-minute break to grab our lunch and return at 12:15. Okay, it's 12:15. And I'd like to call the meeting back from recess and continue on with the next agenda item, which is Soil Protection and Structural Standards Overview. It's an information item. Sarah Esterson, Senior Policy Advisor, will provide us that overview, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chair Howe, Vice Chair Condon, and members of the council. Again, for the record, my name is Sarah Esterson. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for the Oregon Department of Energy Siting Division. And so the presentation today is intended to provide you somewhat of a simplistic snapshot of council's structural and soil protection standards. We presented them together today due to their overlap, and I'll just teaser, it's like an erosion related overlap. The intent is also to support your understanding of, what the analysts do when they receive an application or an amendment for these standards. How do they evaluate information? What's their process? How do they develop recommendations for conditions? And it's also intended to support your preparation of the phase 3 rulemaking, where we'll open up these standards and say, do we like the way the standard is written? Does it make sense? Does the information requirements that are included with the standards, does that make sense? I don't think we're going to hit these standards in 2025, so I apologize for the timing. That's okay. We'll bring it back when we get there. Okay. So first we'll start with the structural standard, which is housed in Chapter 345, Division 22, Sub 0020. The standard is intended to ensure that FSEC jurisdictional facilities are designed in a manner that protects public health and safety in the event of a seismic or a non-seismic hazard. So just for your reference, seismic hazards are those that occur from an earthquake event like ground shaking, fault rupture, landslides, or liquefaction. And then non-seismic hazards include those like erosion, landslides, shallow groundwater. So just wanted to note, this is more like a phase 3 thing, but the structural standard is one of 4 council standards that allows council to approve a wind, solar, or geothermal facility without making findings of compliance. We don't really exercise that. I think anyways, but it's just interesting. There appears to be a carve out for something. Okay, so back to the standard. So the standard requires that council make an affirmative finding that an applicant or a certificate holder has adequately characterized their site for seismic and non-seismic hazards, and that based on those risks, they've demonstrated an ability to design their facility to minimize public health and safety risks should one of those hazards occur. So how does council make such findings? What does an analyst do to recommend findings of fact and conditions in a draft proposed order? That's where you first see their analysis. So we'll start very basically. An applicant or certificate holder first provides the information that's outlined in the standard. So for the structural standard, it includes a geologic report that's prepared by a qualified individual. They have to provide evidence that they've consulted with the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries on the scope and the methods that they plan, they being the applicant or certificate holder, to use to evaluate seismic and non-seismic hazards in their exhibit. They have to present their scope and schedule of on-site, of site-specific geotechnical work. And then they have to propose their design measures, their own conditions for how they'll minimize risk from any seismic or non-seismic hazards. So the first step that an analyst is going to do is they're going to evaluate whether that information was provided. Yes, no. That's easy. But then they're going to start to dive into that information and start to ask whether the information is current, accurate. Is it based on what the Dogami consultation recommended? I mean, it's kind of designed to be somewhat straightforward. You talk to the experts. Normally, we are there at that consultation. We sort of help make sure everybody knows why they're there, because that's an easy miss. The intent again is to talk specifically about the scope and methods that will be used to do the analysis that's presented in the exhibit. So all an applicant or certificate holder has to do is follow those recommendations. We check for that. Then depending on the project location and the type of project, we would go seek subject matter expert review from our consultant, Haley and Aldrich, to help us better understand whether any of the seismic or non-seismic risks have been adequately evaluated. Dogami is a good partner. They're very busy. This is our standard, not theirs. So it's not the easiest task for them to come to the table and be leading this charge of scope and methods to evaluate these risks. So Haley and Aldrich staff can come in. They have ISTs, they have specialists, and they offer their expert opinion about the evaluation. Yes.
Just a quick question. Thank you, Chair Howe. Is Dogami able to bill the applicant for their time?
Absolutely,
Okay,
yes.
great. Thank you. And that helps
Mhm.
with their responsiveness.
Absolutely, yeah. We have, I mean, it's not direct. We have intergovernmental agreements with all of the reviewing agencies. They're set up, they're executed, and we try to remind them to bill their time. They can get reimbursed. It's just one of those things. If they don't already do that, it becomes a hassle for them, and maybe they do it real late, and then that's a hassle for us. So sometimes it doesn't happen at all. They're pro bono at times. Okay, and so then based on our coordination and review with Dogami, with our consultant, we would deem the exhibit complete. So we've determined now we have a set of facts that are accurate, an analysis in an exhibit that is acceptable. And so an analyst extracts the facts they believe are relevant and accurate from an exhibit, and we put it in the DPO, and then we analyze the type of conditions that might be needed, either based on the recommendations that an applicant or certificate holder's own geotech recommended, or Dogami, or our consultant. So oftentimes, you know, I think it looks like you would have a complete exhibit from an application or an amendment, and that information that's there looks very similar to a draft proposed order. It's a little difficult to see, well, what did the department do? But that completeness review, they're doing so much to try to understand what really are the facts that matter, what facts are accurate, to bring those over to land in a place where you can make recommendations. So an analyst extracts those facts, then they pull in mandatory conditions. Council has a mandatory condition in Division 25 that I personally think captures it all. It's an automatic broad. It says certificate holder must design, engineer, and construct a facility to avoid dangers to human safety and the environment presented by seismic hazards. It's I mean, you have to. So, you know, we go further. They haven't often done all site-specific geotech work, so that's almost always a condition that an analyst would recommend, that you have to finish that evaluation, and then you have to adhere to the recommendations that come out of that work. And that becomes a pre-construction condition. So I wanted to give you, I believe I have 2 examples of like where staff evaluated the facts and had issues, and then where we how and where we recommended a condition. So on the screen, you'll see an example. This is an evaluation of a seismic hazard with liquefaction. And this is what it says. It kind of says there's no issues. Our proposed changes won't be impacted by liquefaction. When we read that evaluation, we said, well, the description of the facility components that you've evaluated doesn't include everything in your project description, an underground transmission line specifically. And when we look at the ORESA data, I'm sorry, it's the Oregon statewide geohazards data. When we look at that against your location of facility components, it falls within an area of high susceptibility to liquefaction. So here's just an instance where what the analyst did was compare the project description to the evaluation of impacts. We said you missed one of your project components, and when you overlay that with the data related to liquefaction, we now have a concern that's been omitted. So applicant, you need to fill that gap. So that's a finding of fact effort. Next slide, please. So then here's an example of recommending conditions within a structural exhibit. A level of a geologic report was provided. In that report, we have recommendations from an engineering consultant that said you need to do more evaluation of landslide hazards before you put your transmission line in place. And so we said, because it's not always the case that the developers are going to do what those recommendations say. They could do whatever they want. It's just a recommendation. In this instance, we said, no, you as a condition, you have to do additional landslide hazard evaluation. And the basis was your own geotech indicated it was important. Okay, so that's really the overview of soils, I believe. Give me 1 second to catch up. Yep. So now we're moving into the soil protection standard. Okay, so soil protection is housed in Chapter 345, Division 22, Sub 0022. And the standard requires that council make a finding that with mitigation, construction, and operation of a facility has been demonstrated not to have likely significant adverse impacts on soils. And then the standard provides a non-exhaustive list of impacts that should be evaluated, but includes erosion and chemical spills. So those are the most traditional impacts you'll see every single time for construction, erosion and spills, for operation, erosion and spills. Noting too, though, that erosion is covered in the structural standards, so there's overlap. I don't love overlap. There's too much in exhibits, too much in a DPO. Why? And then also note that for wind and solar, LCDC's wind and solar rules also cover erosion and compaction, which are applied through the council's land use standard. Just phase 3. Okay, next slide, please. So following our format for structural, we would say, how does council make such a finding as required by the standard? What does an analyst do to make recommendations of findings of fact and conditions? So an analyst is going to start with the information requirements that are now housed in the standard language. And for soil protection, that includes a materials inventory. So it's like type and quantities of materials they'll use during construction operation. They have to provide a description of major soil types within the site. They have to identify current land uses in the area. They need to do an assessment of potential impacts and then propose their own mitigation and monitoring measures. So an analyst is going to evaluate, did they give those things? And then they're going to start to drill down on the adequacy of those things. First and foremost, they would look and say, what are the sources of this information based on? Are they based on current, or is this from 1952? Why are they not using 2025 data? Okay, we covered that. Okay, and so erosion and spills are typically, so those are the issues that are typically evaluated in soil protection, and they're traditionally resolved in the same manner per project, which kind of means regardless of the data inputs, that the impact is mitigated through the same protection at the end. For construction, hopefully you've seen it, it's through a Department of Environmental Quality 1200C erosion sediment control plan every single time. So this necessitates a little bit of coordination with DEQ, but it's at permit review, coordinating with DEQ on a permit they haven't issued. Maybe they received it, but it's very preliminary. It's difficult to say, hey, what are the specifics about this project and this site that we really need to understand? But we're building that coordination with them where at least they are thinking about the fact that they should let us know once they get to a decision and we can work together. And then spill risk at a site are typically addressed the same way every time for every project, which is through a spill prevention countermeasure and control plan, which is a federally delegated plan. So it kind of has its own setup. If you're a facility that doesn't trigger those requirements, we often see that developers just propose it anyway because it has so many safeguards. Okay. So it's the same for soil protection. So once we've gone through and evaluated, are the information requirements provided? Are they accurate? Are they adequate? Are they based on current available sources? Note the standard doesn't require like they just require a review of currently available, not best available. We run into that issue sometime. So it has to be like reasonably available sources were evaluated to determine potential soil impacts at a site. Once an analyst has gone through that process, then they would extract those facts into a DPO and then honestly impose the conditions that are the same for erosion protection, spill protection for construction and operation.
Thank you for pointing out compaction, because I think we've had public comments on soil compaction on a couple of projects in terms of restoring agricultural lands, and usually an issue during construction. So a question I had on the spills and other things is, do we have conditions for construction and then operation, or both? I can't remember. Because I know like wildfire, we have very explicit during those two different stages.
So in our like the more recent approach to compaction for solar has shifted in the last couple of years for council. Where in the beginning, we sort of viewed everything within a solar fence line as a permanent impact. And now and so there wasn't, it's like permanently impacted. So you don't decompact it, you don't stabilize it, it's permanently impacted. That was a little bit of a misfire. Fortunately, none of those projects have been built. They're in deadline extension, so we're able to overlay lessons learned before it's too late. But so now our approach is that it's actually, it might be a permanent impact from a habitat perspective, but it's not a permanent impact otherwise. So the issue of compaction, I mean, they have to minimize compaction during construction by not operating the equipment in unnecessary ways. But then decompaction is kind of specific to areas that don't have permanent like access roads or infrastructure, or are the places where they put underground cabling. And so it's kind of specific, but for areas that were truly temporarily impacted during construction, then we're saying, you have to do pre and post compaction testing. And our consultant has helped us to understand that a decent metric is to say your post compaction result has to be 10% or less than your pre-compaction location. And if it's not, then you need to have your guys out there digging it up a little bit deeper because you haven't decompacted. You were too aggressive during construction. And we do hope that the whole point of that is to support revegetation of the site, to minimize noxious weeds, and then ultimately in 30 years to be able to restore it because it's not this densely compacted thing. But we don't do decompaction of the entirety of the solar. And go ahead. Absolutely. Yeah. Right. We've learned so much. I mean, I would say Golden Hills helped us understand so much. And for wind, because of Golden Hills, all of those started to see, and now it's just standard decompaction testing within 10% before they leave that site. Yeah, thanks for that question. Okay, I think next slide, please. I think we have some examples. Okay, so here's an example of what an analyst did during a completeness review. So these are representations from a soil protection exhibit where it would say, I'll just read them. They say the project won't adversely impact soils because best management practices will be implemented. Or it won't result in soil contamination because we'll implement safety procedures. And any potential on-site spills are no big deal because they'll be limited in size. And we're like, what does that mean? We want specifics. We're evidentiary based. So we would say, fine, here's your information request. What are the best management practices, scope and timing, provide the specific safety procedures, and then explain how spills are going to be limited. And, you know, by drawing out these details, then these become represented in the exhibit, and then we bind them through conditions or a mitigation plan. And that's next slide, please. Okay, and this is an example of where we would utilize our analyst's brain to impose conditions. So my favorite example here is this erosion. Erosion impacts during construction. Historically, an applicant would say all issues will be resolved through this DEQ 1200C permit. And, you know, side note that permit is for the protection and federally delegated to DEQ to maintain compliance with the Clean Water Act. So that permit is trying to achieve something different than what we're trying to achieve, which is protection of soil. They sort of end up protecting the same thing, but not in every instance, particularly when you don't have any waters of the state to protect. You could be totally unprotected and we didn't realize it if we don't connect those dots. So because of those different arms, DEQ's interest for Clean Water Act and our interest for protection of soil, then what we would say is as a condition, fine, you can rely on your 1200C, but we want the ability ongoing to evaluate that 1200C and the ESCP through construction. If it's not adequate for council's purposes, that we can overlay ESCP changes, erosion sediment control plan changes, which otherwise wouldn't exist. If DEQ we wouldn't be able to get into the DEQ permit if we don't give ourselves that authority. Okay, and that is, I guess, my last slide. And then we covered compaction. So yeah, so I think that is my quick and dirty overview of those two standards, what we do and how we get there.
Questions, comments from council? Vice Chair Condon?
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. This was quite helpful to see the analysis approach and how it reaches conditions. But can you tell me, has this been the procedure for some time, or has it been strengthened more recently given experience and wanting more consistency between analysts and findings of fact and conditions?
We've been trying for at least the last, 4 years to establish the process that we want the analysts to be using for order drafting. And I think the process is designed to look at the information requirements just as a base for completeness and to coordinate with reviewing agencies. So that's in a way, yes, this has always been the process, but we're like constantly trying to make sure what one person is doing, how their lens is applying it is the same. Consistent. Yeah. And that like, if there is a place where we should be going farther, that we understand that people think that's important. So yeah, but we're evolving like that was part of bringing the analysts into compliance so they could start to see how it actually works on the ground in the field and bring it back and say, oh my gosh. And we already are seeing that, right? But like, we just get this small little glimpse into reality in the paper that is the exhibit. And we've got to be able to open that up a little bit and try to make things just work a little better. Or a lot better.
And thank you. And the reason I asked the question, it just seems over my tenure here, this seems strengthened for evidence. And what I've kind of sometimes struggled with is the specific evidence of, oh yeah, this, yep, this is real evidence as opposed to a statement, like you have put in here as example. So kudos.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions?
Okay, thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Esterson. Well, let's see. I believe that concludes our meeting. Is there anything else good for the order or anything at all? I guess
Chair
the
Howe?
time- Yes, Counselor Grail.
I just want to say, Sarah, great job stepping in. You've kept things afloat for a long time, and with you front and center, everything with Chair Howell, everything went smoothly. So I think it's an appropriate time to give you a pat on the back. You always do amazingly
Yeah.
well to support us, and we appreciate what you did today.
Well said, Counselor Grail. Okay, so the time is now 12:41 PM and the May 16th, 2025 meeting of the Energy Facility Siting Council is now adjourned.
Thank you.